Chapter 21. The Unknowable Room. Harry racked his brains over the next week as to how he was to persuade Slughorn to hand over the true memory, but nothing in the nature of a brainwave occurred, and he was reduced to doing what he did increasingly these days when at a loss, poring over his potions book, hoping that the prince would have scribbled something useful in a margin, as he had done so many times before. "You won't find anything in there," said Hermione firmly, late on Sunday evening. "Don't start, Hermione," said Harry. "If it hadn't been for the prince, Ron wouldn't be sitting here now." "He would, if you just listened to Snape in our first year," said Hermione dismissively. Harry ignored her. He had just found an incantation, Sectum Sempra, scrawled in a margin above the intriguing words "for enemies," and was itching to try it out, but thought it best not to in front of Hermione. Instead, he surreptitiously folded down the corner of the page. They were sitting beside the fire in the common room. The only other people still up were fellow six-years. There had been a certain amount of excitement earlier when they had come back from dinner to find a new sign on the notice board that announced the date of their apparition test. Those who would be 17 on or before the first test date, the 21st of April, had the option of signing up for additional practice sessions, which would take place, heavily supervised, in Hogsmeade. Ron had panicked in reading this notice. He had still not managed to apparate, and feared he would not be ready for the test. Hermione, who had now achieved apparition twice, was a little more confident, but Harry, who would not be 17 for another 4 months, could not take the test whether ready or not. "At least you can apparate, though," said Ron tensely. "You'll have no trouble come July." "I've only done it once," Harry reminded him. He had finally managed to disappear and rematerialise inside his hoop during their previous lesson. Having wasted a lot of time worrying aloud about apparition, Ron was now struggling to finish a viciously difficult essay for Snape that Harry and Hermione had already completed. Harry fully expected to receive low marks on his, because he had disagreed with Snape on the best way to tackle Dementors, but he did not care. Slughorn's memory was the most important thing to him now. "I'm telling you, the stupid prince isn't going to be able to help you with this, Harry," said Hermione more loudly. "There's only one way to force someone to do what you want, and that's the Imperius Curse, which is illegal." "Yeah, I know that, thanks," said Harry, not looking up from the book. "That's why I'm looking for something different. Dumbledore says Veritaserum won't do it, but there might be something else, a potion or a spell." "You're going about it the wrong way," said Hermione. "Only you can get the memory, Dumbledore says. That must mean you can persuade Slughorn where other people can't. It's not a question of slipping him a potion. Anyone could do that." "How do you spell belligerent?" said Ron, shaking his quill very hard while staring at his parchment. "It can't be B-U-M." "No, it isn't," said Hermione, pulling Ron's essay towards her. "And augury doesn't begin O-R-G either. What kind of quill are you using?" "It's one of Fred and George's spell-checking ones, but I think the charm must be wearing off." "Yes, it must," said Hermione, pointing at the title of his essay, "because we were asked how we deal with Dementors, not Dugbogs. And I don't remember you changing your name to Runil Waslib either." "Ah, no," said Ron, staring horror-struck at the parchment. "Don't say I'll have to write the whole thing out again." "It's okay, we can fix it," said Hermione, pulling the essay towards her and taking out her wand. "I love you, Hermione," said Ron, sinking back in his chair, rubbing his eyes wearily. Hermione turned faintly pink, but merely said, "Don't let Lavender hear you saying that." "I won't," said Ron into his hands. "Or maybe I will. Then she'll ditch me." "Why don't you ditch her if you want to finish it?" asked Harry. "You haven't ever chucked anyone, have you?" said Ron. "You and Cho just sort of fell apart, yeah," said Harry. "Wish that would happen with me and Lavender," said Ron gloomily, watching Hermione silently tapping each of his misspelled words with the end of her wand so that they corrected themselves on the page. "But the more I hint I want to finish it, the tighter she holds on. It's like going out with a giant squid." "There," said Hermione, some 20 minutes later, handing back Ron's essay. "Thanks a million," said Ron. "Can I borrow your quill for the conclusion?" Harry, who had found nothing useful in the Half-Blood Prince's notes so far, looked around. The three of them were now the only ones left in the common room, Seamus having just gone up to bed, cursing Snape and his essay. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and Ron scratching out the one last paragraph on Dementors using Hermione's quill. Harry had just closed the Half-Blood Prince's book, yawning, when, crack! Hermione let out a little shriek. Ron spilled ink all over his essay, and Harry said, "Creature." The house elf bowed low and addressed his own gnarled toes. "Master said he wanted regular reports on what the Malfoy boy is doing, so Creature has come to give crack." Dobby appeared alongside Creature, his tea-cosy hat askew. "Dobby has been helping too, Harry Potter," he squeaked, casting Creature a resentful look. And Creature ought to tell Dobby when he is coming to see Harry Potter, so they can make their reports together." "What is this?" asked Hermione, still looking shocked by these sudden appearances. "What's going on, Harry?" Harry hesitated before answering, because he had not told Hermione about setting Creature and Dobby to tail Malfoy. House elves were always such a touchy subject with her. "Well, they've been following Malfoy for me," he said. "Night and day," croaked Creature. "Dobby has not slept for a week, Harry Potter," said Dobby proudly, swaying where he stood. Hermione looked indignant. "You haven't slept, Dobby, but surely, Harry, you didn't tell him not to." "No, of course I didn't," said Harry quickly. "Dobby, you can sleep, all right? But has either of you found out anything?" He hastened to ask before Hermione could intervene again. "Master Malfoy moves with a nobility that befits his pure blood," croaked Creature at once. "His features recall the fine bones of my mistress, and his manners are those of—" "Draco Malfoy is a bad boy," squeaked Dobby angrily. "A bad boy? Who? He shuddered from the tassel of his tea cosy to the toes of his socks, and then ran at the fire, as though about to dive into it. Harry, to whom this was not entirely unexpected, caught him around the middle and held him fast. For a few seconds Dobby struggled, and then went limp. "Thank you, Harry Potter," he panted. "Dobby still finds it difficult to speak ill of his old masters." Harry released him. Dobby straightened his tea cosy and said defiantly to Creature, "But Creature should know that Draco Malfoy is not a good master to a house elf." "Yeah, we don't need to hear about you being in love with Malfoy," Harry told Creature. "Let's fast forward to where he's actually been going." Creature bowed again, looking furious, and then said, "Master Malfoy eats in the Great Hall. He sleeps in a dormitory in the dungeons. He attends his classes in a variety of—" "Dobby, you tell me," said Harry, cutting across Creature. "Has he been going anywhere he shouldn't have?" "Harry Potter, sir," squeaked Dobby, his great orb-like eyes shining in the firelight. "The Malfoy boy is breaking no rules that Dobby can discover, but he is still keen to avoid detection. He has been making regular visits to the 7th floor with a variety of other students, who keep watch for him while he enters." "The room of requirement," said Harry, smacking himself hard on the forehead with an advanced potion-making. Hermione and Ron stared at him. "That's where he's been sneaking off to. That's where he's doing whatever he's doing. And I bet that's why he's been disappearing off the map. Come to think of it, I've never seen the room of requirement on there." "Maybe the marauders never knew the room was there," said Ron. "I think it'll be part of the magic of the room," said Hermione. "If you need it to be unplottable, it will be." "Dobby, have you managed to get in to have a look at what Malfoy's doing?" said Harry eagerly. "No, Harry Potter, that is impossible," said Dobby. "No, it's not," said Harry at once. "Malfoy got into our headquarters there last year, so I'll be able to get in and spy on him, no problem." "But I think you will, Harry," said Hermione slowly. "Malfoy already knew exactly how we were using the room, didn't he? Because that stupid Marietta had blabbed. He needed the room to become the headquarters of the DA, so it did. But you don't know what the room becomes when Malfoy goes in there, so you don't know what to ask it to transform into." "There'll be a way around that," said Harry dismissively. "You've done brilliantly, Dobby." "Creature's done well too," said Hermione kindly, but far from looking grateful, Creature averted his huge bloodshot eyes and croaked at the ceiling. "The mudblood is speaking to Creature. Creature will pretend he cannot hear." "Get out of it," Harry snapped at him, and Creature made one last deep bow and disapparated. "You better go and get some sleep too, Dobby." "Thank you, Harry Potter, sir," squeaked Dobby happily, and he too vanished. "How good's this?" said Harry enthusiastically, turning to Ron and Hermione the moment the room was elf-free again. "We know where Malfoy's going. We've got him cornered now." "Yeah, it's great," said Ron glumly, who was attempting to mop up the sodden mass of ink that had recently been an almost completed essay. Hermione pulled it towards her and began siphoning the ink off with a wand. "But what's all this about him going up there with a variety of students?" said Hermione. "How many people are in on it? You wouldn't think he'd trust lots of them to know what he's doing." "Yeah, that is weird," said Harry, frowning. "I heard him telling Crabbe it wasn't Crabbe's business what he was doing. So what's he telling all these... Harry's voice trailed away. He was staring at the fire. "God, I've been stupid," he said quietly. "It's obvious, isn't it? There was a great vat of it down in the dungeon. He could have nicked some any time during that lesson." "Nicked what?" said Ron. "Polyjuice potion. He stole some of the Polyjuice potions Slughorn showed us in our first potions lesson. There aren't a whole variety of students standing guard for Malfoy. It's just Crabbe and Goyle, as usual." "Yeah, it all fits," said Harry, jumping up and starting to pace in front of the fire. They're stupid enough to do what they're told, even if he won't tell them what he's up to. But he doesn't want to be seen lurking around outside the room of requirement, so he's got them taking polyjuice to make them look like other people. Those 2 girls I saw him with when he missed Quidditch. Ha! Crabbe and Goyle! Do you mean to say, said Hermione in a hushed voice, that little girl whose scales I required? Yeah, of course, said Harry loudly, staring at her. Of course. Malfoy must have been inside the room at the time, so she... What am I talking about? He dropped the scales to tell Malfoy not to come out, because there was someone there. And there was that girl who dropped the toad spawn too. We've been walking past him all the time, and not realising it. He's got Crabbe and Goyle transforming into girls, guffawed Ron. Blimey, no wonder they don't look too happy these days. I'm surprised they don't tell him to stuff it. Well, they wouldn't, would they, if he's shown them his dark mark, said Harry. The dark mark we don't know exists, said Hermione sceptically, rolling up Ron's dried essay before it could come to any more harm and handing it to him. We'll see, said Harry confidently. Yes, we will, Hermione said, getting to her feet and stretching. But Harry, before you get all excited, I still don't think you'll be able to get into the room of requirement without knowing what's there first. And I don't think you should forget, she heaved her bag onto her shoulder and gave him a very serious look, that what you're supposed to be concentrating on is getting that memory from Slughorn. Good night. Harry watched her go, feeling slightly disgruntled. Once the door to the girls' dormitories had closed behind her, he rounded on Ron. What do you think? Wish I could disapparate like a house elf, said Ron, staring at the spot where Dobby had vanished. I'd have that apparition test in the bag. Harry did not sleep well that night. He lay awake for what felt like hours, wondering how Malfoy was using the room of requirement, and what he, Harry, would see when he went in there the following day. For whatever Hermione said, Harry was sure that if Malfoy had been able to see the headquarters of the DA, he would be able to see Malfoy's. What could it be? A meeting place? A hideout? A storeroom? A workshop? Harry's mind worked feverishly, and his dreams, when he finally fell asleep, were broken and disturbed by images of Malfoy, who turned into Slughorn, who turned into Snape. Harry was in a state of great anticipation over breakfast the following morning. He had a free period before Defence Against the Dark Arts, and was determined to spend it trying to get into the room of requirement. Hermione was rather ostentatiously showing no interest in his whispering plans for forcing entry into the room, which irritated Harry, because he thought she might be a lot of help if she wanted to. Look, he said quietly, leaning forwards and putting a hand on the Daily Prophet, which she had just removed from a post-owl, to stop her opening it and vanishing behind it. I haven't forgotten about Slughorn, but I haven't got a clue how to get that memory off him, and until I get a brainwave, why shouldn't I find out what Malfoy's doing? I've already told you, you need to persuade Slughorn, said Hermione. It's not a question of tricking him or bewitching him, or Dumbledore could have done it in a second. Instead of messing around outside the room of requirement, she jerked the Prophet out from under Harry's hand and unfolded it to look at the front page. You should go and find Slughorn and start appealing to his better nature. Anyone we know? Asked Ron, as Hermione scanned the headlines. Yes, said Hermione, causing both Harry and Ron to gag on their breakfast. But it's all right, he's not dead. It's Mundungus. He's been arrested and sent to Azkaban. Something to do with impersonating an Inferius during an attempted burglary. And someone called Octavius Pepper has vanished. Oh, and how horrible! A 9-year-old boy has been arrested for trying to kill his grandparents. They think he was under the Imperius curse. They finished their breakfast in silence. Hermione set off immediately for Ancient Runes, Ron for the common room, where he still had to finish his conclusion on Snape's Dementor essay, and Harry for the corridor on the 7th floor and the stretch of wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, teaching trolls to do ballet. Harry slipped on his invisibility cloak once he had found an empty passage, but he need not have bothered. When he reached his destination, he found it deserted. Harry was not sure whether his chances of getting inside the room were better with Malfoy inside it or not, but at least his first attempt was not going to be complicated by the presence of Crabbe or Goyle pretending to be an 11-year-old girl. He closed his eyes as he approached the place where the room of requirement's door was concealed. He knew what he had to do. He had become most accomplished at it last year. Concentrating with all his might, he thought, I need to see what Malfoy's doing in here. I need to see what Malfoy's doing in here. I need to see what Malfoy's doing in here. 3 times he walked past the door. Then, his heart pounding with excitement, he opened his eyes and faced it. But he was still looking at a stretch of mundanely blank wall. He moved forwards and gave it an experimental push. The stone remained solid and unyielding. Okay, said Harry aloud. Okay, I thought the wrong thing. He pondered for a moment, and then set off again, eyes closed, concentrating as hard as he could. I need to see the place where Malfoy keeps going secretly. I need to see the place where Malfoy keeps going secretly. After 3 walks past, he opened his eyes expectantly. There was no door. Oh, come off it, he told the wall irritably. That was a clear instruction. Fine. He thought hard for several minutes before striding off once more. I need to become the place you become for Draco Malfoy. He did not immediately open his eyes when he had finished his patrolling. He was listening hard as though he might hear the door pop into existence. He heard nothing, however, except the distant twittering of birds outside. He opened his eyes. There was still no door. Harry swore. Someone screamed. He looked around to see a gaggle of first-years running back around the corner, apparently under the impression that they had just encountered a particularly foul-mouthed ghost. Harry tried every variation of "I need to see what Draco Malfoy is doing inside you" that he could think of for a whole hour, at the end of which he was forced to concede that Hermione might have had a point. The room simply did not want to open for him. Frustrated and annoyed, he set off a defence against the dark arts, pulling off his invisibility cloak and stuffing it into his bag as he went. "Late again, Potter," said Snape coldly, as Harry hurried into the candlelit classroom. 10 points from Gryffindor. Harry scowled at Snape as he flung himself into the seat beside Ron. Half the class was still on its feet, taking out books and organising its things. He could not be much later than any of them. "Before we start, I want your Dementor essays," said Snape, waving his wand carelessly so that 25 scrolls of parchment soared into the air and landed in a neat pile on his desk. "And I hope for your sakes they are better than the tripe I had to endure on resisting the Imperious Curse. Now, if you open your books at page—" "What is it, Mr. Finnegan?" "Sir?" said Seamus. I've been wondering, how do you tell the difference between an Imperious and a ghost? Because there was something in the Prophet about an Imperious." "No, there wasn't," said Snape in a bored voice. "Sir, I heard people talking." "If you had actually read the article in question, Mr. Finnegan, you would have known that the so-called Imperious was nothing but a smelly sneak thief by the name of Mundungus Fletcher." "I thought Snape and Mundungus were on the same side," muttered Harry to Ron and Hermione. "Shouldn't he be upset Mundungus has been arrested?" "But Potter seems to have a lot to say on the subject," said Snape, pointing suddenly at the back of the room, his black eyes fixed on Harry. "Let us ask Potter how we would tell the difference between an Imperious and a ghost." The whole class looked around at Harry, who hastily tried to recall what Dumbledore had told him the night that they had gone to visit Slughorn. Well, ghosts are transparent," he said. "Oh, very good," interrupted Snape, his lip curling. "Yes, it is easy to see that nearly 6 years of magical education have not been wasted on you, Potter. Ghosts are transparent." Pansy Parkinson let out a high-pitched giggle. Several other people were smirking. Harry took a deep breath and continued calmly, though his insides were boiling. "Yeah, ghosts are transparent, but in theory are dead bodies, aren't they? So they'd be solid." "A 5-year-old could have told us much," sneered Snape. "The Imperious is a corpse that has been reanimated by a dark wizard's spells. It is not alive, it is merely used like a puppet to do the wizard's bidding. A ghost, as I trust that you are all aware by now, is the imprint of a departed soul left upon the earth, and of course, as Potter so wisely tells us, transparent." "Well, what Harry said is the most useful if we're trying to tell them apart," said Ron. "When we come face to face with one down a dark alley, we're going to be having a shufty to see if it's solid, aren't we? We're not going to be asking, 'Excuse me, are you an imprint of a departed soul?'" There was a ripple of laughter, instantly quelled by the look Snape gave the class. "Another 10 points from Gryffindor," said Snape. "I would expect nothing more sophisticated from you, Ronald Weasley. The boy so solid he can apparate half an inch across a room." "No," whispered Hermione, grabbing Harry's arm as he opened his mouth furiously. "There's no point. You'll just end up in detention again. Leave it." "Now open your books at page 213, said Snape, smirking a little, "and read the first 2 paragraphs on the Cruciatus Curse." Ron was very subdued all through the class. When the bell sounded at the end of the lesson, Lavender caught up with Ron and Harry. Hermione mysteriously melted out of sight as she approached, and abused Snape hotly for his jibe about Ron's apparition. But this seemed merely to irritate Ron, and he shook her off by making a detour into the boys' bathroom with Harry. "Snape's right, though, isn't he?" said Ron, after staring into a cracked mirror for a minute or two. "I don't know whether it's worth me taking the test. I just can't get the hang of apparition." "You might as well do the extra practice sessions in Hogsmeade and see where they get you," said Harry reasonably. "It'll be more interesting than trying to get into a stupid hoop anyway. Then, if you're still not, as good as you'd like to be, you can postpone the test. Do it with me over the Myrtle, this is the boys' bathroom." The ghost of a girl had risen out of a toilet in a cubicle behind them and was now floating in mid-air, staring at them through thick, white, round glasses. "Oh," she said glumly, "it's you two." "Who were you expecting?" said Ron, looking at her in the mirror. "Nobody," said Myrtle, picking moodily at a spot on her chin. "He said he'd come back and see me, but then you said you'd pop in and visit me too." She gave Harry a reproachful look. "And I haven't seen you for months and months. I've learned not to expect too much from boys." "I thought you lived in that girl's bathroom," said Harry, who had been careful to give the place a wide berth for some years now. "I do," she said, with a sulky little shrug, "but that doesn't mean I can't visit other places. I came and saw you in your bath once, remember?" "Vividly," said Harry. "But I thought he liked me," she said plaintively. "Maybe if you two left he'd come back again. We had lots in common. I'm sure he felt it." And she looked hopefully towards the door. "When you say you had lots in common," said Ron, sounding rather amused now, "do you mean he lives in an S-Bend too?" "No," said Myrtle defiantly, her voice echoing loudly around the old tile bathroom. "I mean, he's sensitive. People bully him too, and he feels lonely and hasn't got anybody to talk to, and he's not afraid to show his feelings and cry." "There's been a boy in here crying," said Harry curiously. "A young boy?" "Never you mind," said Myrtle, her small, leaky eyes fixed on Ron, who was now defiantly grinning. "I promised I wouldn't tell anyone, and I'll take his secret to the—" "Not the grave, surely," said Ron with a snort. "The sewers, maybe." Myrtle gave a howl of rage and dived back into the toilet, causing water to slop over the sides and onto the floor. Goading Myrtle seemed to have put fresh heart into Ron. "You're right," he said, swinging his school bag back over his shoulder. "I'll do the practice sessions in Hogsmeade before I decide about taking the test." And so the following weekend Ron joined Hermione and the rest of the 6 years, who would turn 17 in time to take the test in a fortnight. Harry felt rather jealous, watching them all get ready to go into the village. He missed making trips there, and it was a particularly fine spring day, one of the first clear skies they had seen in a long time. However, he had decided to use the time to attempt another assault on the Room of Requirement. "You'd do better," said Hermione, when he confided this plan to Ron and her in the entrance hall, "to go straight to Slughorn's office and try to get that memory from him." "I've been trying," said Harry crossly, which was perfectly true. He had lagged behind after every potions lesson that week in an attempt to corner Slughorn, but the potions master always left the dungeon so fast that Harry had not been able to catch him. Twice Harry had gone to his office and knocked, but received no reply, though on the second occasion he was sure he had heard the thickly stifled sounds of an old gramophone. "He doesn't want to talk to me, Hermione. He can tell I've been trying to get him on his own again, and he's not going to let it happen." "Well, you've just got to keep at it, haven't you?" The short queue of people waiting to file past Filch, who was doing his usual prodding act with the secrecy sensor, moved forwards a few steps, and Harry did not answer in case he was overheard by the caretaker. He wished Ron and Hermione luck, and then turned and climbed the marble staircase again, determined, whatever Hermione said, to devote an hour or two to the Room of Requirement. Once out of sight of the entrance hall, Harry pulled out the Marauder's map and his invisibility cloak from his bag. Having concealed himself, he tapped the map, murmured, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," and scanned it carefully. As it was Sunday morning, nearly all the students were inside their various common rooms, the Gryffindors in one tower, the Ravenclaws in another, the Slytherins in the dungeons, and the Hufflepuffs in the basement near the kitchens. Here and there a stray person meandered around the library or up a corridor. There were a few people out in the grounds, and there, alone, in the 7th floor corridor, was Gregory Goyle. There was no sign of the Room of Requirement, but Harry was not worried about that. If Goyle was standing guard outside it, the room was open, whether the map was aware of it or not. He therefore sprinted up the stairs, slowing down only when he reached the corner into the corridor, when he began to creep very slowly towards the very same little girl, clutching her heavy brass scales. But Hermione had so kindly helped a fortnight before. He waited until he was right behind her, before bending very low and whispering, "Hello, you're very pretty, aren't you?" Goyle gave a high-pitched scream of terror, threw the scales up into the air and sprinted away, vanishing from sight long before the sound of the scales smashing had stopped echoing around the corridor. Laughing, Harry turned to contemplate the blank wall behind which, he was sure, Draco Malfoy was now standing frozen, aware that someone unwelcome was out there, but not daring to make an appearance. It gave Harry a most agreeable feeling of power as he tried to remember what form of words he had not yet tried. Yet this hopeful mood did not last long. Half an hour later, having tried many more variations of his request to see what Malfoy was up to, the wall was just as doorless as ever. Harry felt frustrated beyond belief. Malfoy might be just 2 feet away from him, and there was still not the tiniest shred of evidence as to what he was doing in there. Losing his patience completely, Harry ran at the wall and kicked it. Ouch! He thought he might have broken his toe. As he clutched it and hopped on one foot, the invisibility cloak slipped off him. Harry? He spun around, one-legged, and toppled over. There, to his utter astonishment, was Tonks, walking towards him, as though she frequently strolled up this corridor. "What are you doing here?" he said, scrambling to his feet again. Why did she always have to find him lying on the floor? "I came to see Dumbledore," said Tonks. Harry thought she looked terrible, thinner than usual, her mouse-coloured hair lank. "His office isn't here," said Harry. "It's round the other side of the castle, behind the gargoyle." "I know," said Tonks. "He's not there. Apparently he's gone away again." "Has he?" said Harry, putting his bruised foot gingerly back on the floor. "Hey, you don't know where he goes, I suppose?" "No," said Tonks. "What do you want to see him about?" "Nothing in particular," said Tonks, picking apparently unconsciously at the sleeve of her robe. "I just thought he might know what's going on. I've heard rumours. People getting hurt." "Yeah, I know. It's been in the papers," said Harry. "That little kid trying to kill his—" "The prophet's often behind the times," said Tonks, who didn't seem to be listening to him. "You haven't had any letters from anyone in the Order recently?" "No one from the Order writes to me anymore," said Harry. "Not since Sirius." He saw that her eyes had filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he muttered awkwardly. I miss him as well." "What?" said Tonks blankly, as though she had not heard him. "Well, I'll see you around, Harry." As she turned abruptly and walked back down the corridor, leaving Harry to stare after her. After a minute or so, he pulled the invisibility cloak on again and resumed his efforts to get into the room of requirement, but his heart was not in it. Finally, a hollow feeling in his stomach, and the knowledge that Ron and Hermione would soon be back for lunch, made him abandon the attempt and leave the corridor to Malfoy, who hopefully would be too afraid to leave for some hours to come. He found Ron and Hermione in the Great Hall, already halfway through an early lunch. "I did it." Well, kind of," Ron told Harry enthusiastically when he caught sight of him. "I was supposed to be apparating to outside Madame Puddifoot's tea shop, and I overshot it a bit. Ended up near Scriven Shafts, but at least I moved." "Good one," said Harry. "How did you do, Hermione?" "Oh, she was perfect, obviously," said Ron, before Hermione could answer. "Perfect deliberation, divination, and desperation, or whatever the hell it is. We all went for a quick drink in the Free Broomsticks after. You should have heard Twycross going on about her. I'll be surprised if he doesn't pop the question soon." "And what about you?" asked Hermione, ignoring Ron. "Have you been up to the room of requirement all this time?" "Yep," said Harry. "And guess who I ran into up there?" "Tonks." "Tonks," repeated Ron and Hermione together, looking surprised. "Yeah, she said she'd come to visit Dumbledore." "If you ask me," said Ron, once Harry had finished describing his conversation with Tonks, "she's cracking up a bit, losing her nerve after what happened at the Ministry." "It's a bit odd," said Hermione, who for some reason looked very concerned. "She's supposed to be guarding the school. Why is she suddenly abandoning her post to come and see Dumbledore when he's not even here?" "I had a thought," said Harry tentatively. He felt strange about voicing it. This was much more Hermione's territory than his. "You don't think she can have been, in love with Sirius?" Hermione stared at him. "What on earth makes you say that?" "I don't know," said Harry, shrugging, "but she was nearly crying when I mentioned his name. And her Patronus is a big 4-legged thing now. I wondered whether it hadn't become, him." "It's a thought," said Hermione slowly, "but I still don't know why she'd be bursting into the castle to see Dumbledore. If that's really why she was here." "Goes back to what I said, doesn't it?" said Ron, who was now shoveling mashed potato into his mouth. "She's gone a bit funny, lost her nerve." "Women," he said wisely to Harry. "They're easily upset." "And yet," said Hermione, coming out of her reverie, "I doubt you'd find a woman who sulked for half an hour because Madame Rosmerta didn't laugh at their joke about the hag, the healer, and the Mimbleless Mimbletonia." Ron scowled. Chapter 22. After the Burial. Patches of bright blue sky were beginning to appear over the castle turrets, but these signs of approaching summer did not lift Harry's mood. He had been thwarted, both in his attempts to find out what Malfoy was doing and in his efforts to start a conversation with Slughorn that might lead somehow to Slughorn handing over the memory he had apparently suppressed for decades. "For the last time, just forget about Malfoy," Hermione told Harry firmly. They were sitting with Ron in a sunny corner of the courtyard after lunch. Hermione and Ron were both clutching a Ministry of Magic leaflet, Common Apparition Mistakes and How to Avoid Them, for they were taking their tests that very afternoon. But by and large the leaflets had not proved soothing to the nerves. Ron gave a start and tried to hide behind Hermione as a girl came around the corner. "It isn't lavender," said Hermione wearily. "Oh, good," said Ron, relaxing. "Harry Potter," said the girl, "I was asked to give you this." "Thanks." Harry's heart sank as he took the small scroll of parchment. Once the girl was out of earshot, he said, "Dumbledore said we wouldn't be having any more lessons until I got the memory." "Maybe he wants to check on how you're doing," suggested Hermione, as Harry unrolled the parchment. But rather than finding Dumbledore's long, narrow, slanting writing, he saw an untidy scrawl, with very difficult to read, due to the presence of large blotches on the parchment where the ink had run. "Dear Harry, Ron and Hermione, Aragog died last night. Harry and Ron, you met him, and you know how special he was. Hermione, I know you'd have liked him. It would mean a lot to me if you'd nip down for the burial later this evening. I'm planning on doing it around dusk. That was his favourite time of day. I know you're not supposed to be out that late, but you can use the cloak. Wouldn't ask, but I face it alone. Hagrid." "Look at this," said Harry, handing the note to Hermione. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said, scanning it quickly and passing it to Ron, who read it through, looking increasingly incredulous. "He's mental," he said furiously. "That thing told its mates to eat Harry and me, told him to help themselves, and now Hagrid expects us to go down there and cry over its horrible hairy body." "It's not just that," said Hermione. "He's asking us to leave the castle at night, and he knows security's 1,000,000 times tighter, and how much trouble we'd be in if we were caught." "We've been down to see him by night before," said Harry. "Yes, but for something like this," said Hermione. We've risked a lot to help Hagrid out, but after all, Aragog's dead. If it were a question of saving him..." "I'd want to go even less," said Ron firmly. "You didn't meet him, Hermione. Believe me, being dead will have improved him a lot." Harry took the note back and stared down at the inky blotches all over it. Tears had clearly fallen thick and fast upon the parchment. "Harry, you can't be thinking of going," said Hermione. "It's such a pointless thing to get detention for." Harry sighed. "Yeah, I know," he said. "Suppose Hagrid'll have to bury Aragog without us." "Yes, he will," said Hermione, looking relieved. "Look, potions will be almost empty this afternoon, with us all off doing our tests. Try and soften Slughorn up a bit, then." 57th time lucky, you think?" said Harry bitterly. "Lucky," said Ron suddenly. "Harry, that's it. Get lucky." "What do you mean? Use your lucky potion." "Ron, that's it," said Hermione, sounding stunned. "Of course. Why didn't I think of it?" Harry stared at them both. "Felix Felicis," he said. "I don't know. I was sort of saving it." "What for?" demanded Ron incredulously. "What on earth is more important than this memory, Harry?" asked Hermione. Harry did not answer. The thought of that little golden bottle had hovered on the edges of his imagination for some time, vague and unformulated plans that involved Ginny splitting up with Dean, and Ron somehow being happy to see her with a new boyfriend had been fermenting on the depths of his brain, unacknowledged except during dreams of the twilight time between sleeping and waking. "Harry, are you still with us?" asked Hermione. "Well, yeah, of course," he said, pulling himself together. "Well, OK, if I can't get Slughorn to talk this afternoon, I'll take some Felix and have another go this evening." "That's decided then," said Hermione briskly, getting to her feet and performing a graceful pirouette. "Destination, determination, deliberation," she murmured. "Oh, stop that," Ron begged her. "I feel sick enough as it is. Quick, hide me." "It isn't lavender," said Hermione impatiently, as another couple of girls appeared in the courtyard, and Ron dived behind her. "Cool," said Ron, peering over Hermione's shoulder to check. "Blimey, they don't look happy, do they?" "They're the Montgomery sisters, and of course they don't look happy. Didn't you hear what happened to their little brother?" said Hermione. "I'm losing track of what's happening to everyone's relatives, to be honest," said Ron. "Well, their brother was attacked by a werewolf. The rumour is that their mother refused to help the Death Eaters. Anyway, the boy was only 5 and he died in St Mungo's. They couldn't save him." "He died?" repeated Harry, shocked. "But surely werewolves don't kill. They just turn you into one of them." "They sometimes kill," said Ron, who looked unusually grave now. "I've heard of it happening when the werewolf gets carried away." "What was the werewolf's name?" said Harry quickly. "Well, the rumour is that it was that Fenrir Greyback," said Hermione. "I knew it. The maniac who likes attacking kids, the one Lupin told me about," said Harry angrily. Hermione looked at him bleakly. "Harry, you've got to get that memory," she said. "It's all about stopping Voldemort, isn't it? These dreadful things that are happening are all down to him." The bell rang overhead in the castle, and both Hermione and Ron jumped to their feet, looking terrified. "You'll do fine," Harry told them both, as they headed towards the entrance hall to meet the rest of the people taking their apparition test. "Good luck." "And you too," said Hermione with a significant look, as Harry headed off to the dungeons. There were only 3 of them in potions that afternoon, Harry, Ernie and Draco Malfoy. "All too young to apparate just yet," said Slughorn genially. "Not turned 17 yet." They shook their heads. "Ah, well," said Slughorn cheerily, "as we're so few, we'll do something fun. I want you all to brew me up something amusing." "That sounds good, sir," said Ernie sympathetically, rubbing his hands together. Malfoy, on the other hand, did not crack a smile. "What do you mean, something amusing?" he said irritably. "Oh, surprise me," said Slughorn airily. Malfoy opened his copy of Advanced Potion Making with a sulky expression. It could not have been plainer that he thought this lesson was a waste of time. Undoubtedly, Harry thought, watching him over the top of his own book, Malfoy was begrudging the time he could otherwise be spending in the room of requirement. Was it his imagination, or did Malfoy, like Tonks, look thinner? Certainly he looked paler. His skin still had that greyish tinge, probably because he was so rarely seeing daylight these days. But there was no air of smugness or excitement or superiority, none of the swagger that he had had on the Hogwarts Express when he had boasted openly of the mission he had been given by Voldemort. There could only be one conclusion, in Harry's opinion. The mission, whatever it was going badly. Cheered by this thought, Harry skimmed through his copy of Advanced Potion Making and found a heavily corrected Half-Blood Prince's version of an elixir to induce euphoria, which seemed not only to meet Slughorn's instructions, but which might, Harry's heart leapt as the thought struck him, put Slughorn into such a good mood that he would be prepared to hand over that memory if Harry could persuade him to taste some. "Well now, this looks absolutely wonderful," said Slughorn, clapping his hands together an hour and a half later, as he stared down into the sunshine-yellow contents of Harry's cauldron. "Euphoria, I take it. And what's that I smell? You've added just a sprig of peppermint, haven't you? Unorthodox, but what a stroke of inspiration, Harry. Of course, that would tend to counterbalance the occasional side effects of excessive singing and nose-tweaking. I really don't know where you get these brainwaves, my boy, unless—" Harry pushed the Half-Blood Prince's book deeper into his bag with his foot. "It's just your mother's genes coming out in you." "Oh yeah, maybe," said Harry, relieved. Ernie was looking rather grumpy, determined to outshine Harry for once. He had just rashly invented his own potion, which had curdled and formed a kind of purple dumpling on the bottom of his cauldron. Malfoy was already packing up, sour-faced. Slughorn had pronounced his hiccuping solution merely passable. The bell rang and both Ernie and Malfoy left at once. "Sir," Harry began, but Slughorn immediately glanced over his shoulder. When he saw that the room was empty but for himself and Harry, he hurried away as fast as he could. Professor, don't you want to taste my called Harry desperately, but Slughorn had gone. Disappointed, Harry emptied the cauldron, packed up his things, left the dungeon and walked slowly back upstairs to the common room. Ron and Hermione returned in the late afternoon. "Harry," cried Hermione as she climbed through the portrait hole. "Harry, I passed." "Well done," he said. "And Ron? He just failed," whispered Hermione, as Ron came slouching into the room looking most morose. "He was really unlucky. A tiny thing. The examiner just spotted that he'd left half an eyebrow behind. How did it go with Slughorn?" "No joy," said Harry, as Ron joined them. "Bad luck, mate, but you'll pass next time. We can take it together." "Yeah, I suppose," said Ron grumpily. "But half an eyebrow? Like that matters." "I know," said Hermione soothingly. "It does seem really harsh." They spent most of their dinner roundly abusing the apparition examiner, and Ron looked fractionally more cheerful by the time they set off back to the common room, now discussing the continuing problem of Slughorn and the memory. "So, Harry, you going to use the Felix Felicis or what?" Ron demanded. "Yeah, suppose I'd better," said Harry. "I don't reckon I'll need all of it, but not 12 hours worth. It can't take all night. I'll just take a mouthful. 2 or 3 hours should do it." "It's a great feeling when you take it," said Ron reminiscently, "like you can't do anything wrong." "What are you talking about?" said Hermione, laughing. "You've never taken any." "Yeah, but I thought I had, didn't I?" said Ron, as though explaining the obvious. Same difference, really. As they had only just seen Slughorn enter the great hall, and knew that he liked to take time over meals, they lingered for a while in the common room, the plan being that Harry should go to Slughorn's office once the teacher had had time to get back there. When the sun had sunk to the level of the treetops in the Forbidden Forest, they decided the moment had come, and after checking carefully that Neville, Dean and Seamus were all in the common room, sneaked up to the boys' dormitory. Harry took out a rolled-up socks at the bottom of his trunk and extracted the tiny, gleaming bottle. "Well, Here goes, said Harry, and he raised the little bottle and took a carefully measured gulp. What does it feel like? Whispered Hermione. Harry did not answer for a moment. Then, slowly but surely, an exhilarating sense of infinite opportunity stole through him. He felt as though he could have done anything at all, and getting the memory from Slughorn seemed suddenly not only possible, but positively easy. He got to his feet smiling, brimful of confidence. Excellent, he said. Really excellent. Right, I'm going down to Hagrid's. What? Said Ron and Hermione together, looking aghast. No, Harry, you've got to go and see Slughorn, remember? Said Hermione. No, said Harry confidently. I'm going to Hagrid's. I've got a good feeling about going to Hagrid's. You've got a good feeling about burying a giant spider? Asked Ron, looking stunned. Yes, said Harry, pulling his invisibility cloak out of his bag. I feel like it's the place to be tonight. You know what I mean? No, said Ron and Hermione together, both looking positively alarmed now. This is Felix Felicis, I suppose, said Hermione anxiously, holding up the bottle to the light. You haven't got another little bottle full of, I don't know, essence of insanity? Suggested Ron, as Harry swung his cloak over his shoulders. Harry laughed, and Ron and Hermione looked even more alarmed. Trust me, he said. I know what I'm doing. Or at least, he strolled confidently to the door. Felix does. He pulled the invisibility cloak over his head and set off down the stairs, Ron and Hermione hurrying along behind him. At the foot of the stairs, Harry slid through the open door. What were you doing up there with her? Shrieked Lavender Brown, staring right through Harry at Ron and Hermione emerging together from the boys' dormitories. Harry heard Ron spluttering behind him as he darted across the room away from them. Getting through the portrait hole was simple. As he approached it, Ginny and Dean came through it, and Harry was able to slip between them. As he did so, he brushed accidentally against Ginny. Don't push me, please, Dean, she said, sounding annoyed. You're always doing that. I can get through perfectly well on my own. The portrait swung closed behind Harry, but not before he had heard Dean make an angry retort. His feeling of elation increasing, Harry strode off through the castle. He did not have to creep along, for he met nobody on his way. But this did not surprise him in the slightest this evening. He was the luckiest person at Hogwarts. Why he knew that going to Hagrid's was the right thing to do, he had no idea. It was as though the potion was illuminating a few steps of the path at a time. He could not see the final destination. He could not see where Slughorn came in, but he knew that he was going in the right way to get that memory. When he reached the entrance hall, he saw that Filch had forgotten to lock the front door. Beaming, Harry threw it open and breathed in the smell of clean air and grass for a moment before walking down the steps into the dusk. It was when he reached the bottom step that it occurred to him how very pleasant it would be to pass the vegetable patch on his walk to Hagrid's. It was not strictly on the way, but it seemed clear to Harry that this was a whim on which he should act. So he directed his feet immediately towards the vegetable patch, where he was pleased but not altogether surprised to find Professor Slughorn in conversation with Professor Sprout. Harry lurked behind a low stone wall, feeling at peace with the world and listening to their conversation. I do thank you for taking the time, Pomona, Slughorn was saying courteously. Most authorities agree that they are at their most efficacious if picked at twilight. Oh, I quite agree, said Professor Sprout warmly. That enough for you? Plenty, plenty, said Slughorn, who Harry saw was carrying an armful of leafy plants. This should allow for a few leaves for each of my third years, and some to spare if anybody overstews them. Well, good evening to you, and many thanks again. Professor Sprout headed off into the gathering darkness in the direction of the greenhouses, and Slughorn directed his steps to the spot where Harry stood, invisible. Seized with an immediate desire to reveal himself, Harry pulled off the cloak with a flourish. Good evening, Professor. Merlin's beard, Harry! You made me jump, said Slughorn, stopping dead in his tracks and looking wary. How did you get out of the castle? I think Filch must have forgotten to lock the doors, said Harry cheerfully, and was delighted to see Slughorn scowl. I'll be reporting that man. He's more concerned about litter than proper security, if you ask me. But why are you out here, Harry? Well, sir, it's Hagrid, said Harry, who knew that the right thing to do just now was to tell the truth. He's pretty upset, but you won't tell anyone, Professor. I don't want trouble for him. Slughorn's curiosity was evidently aroused. Well, I can't promise that, he said gruffly, but I know that Dumbledore trusts Hagrid to the hilt, so I'm sure he can't be up to anything very dreadful. Well, it's this giant spider. He's had it for years. It lived in the forest. It could talk and everything. I heard rumours there were acromantula in the forest, said Slughorn softly, looking over at the mass of black trees. It's true, then? Yes, said Harry, but this one, Aragog, the first one Hagrid ever got. It died last night. He's devastated. He wants company while he buries it, and I said I'd go. Touching, touching, said Slughorn absent-mindedly, his large droopy eyes fixed upon the distant lights of Hagrid's cabin. But acromantula venom is very valuable. If the beast has only just died, it might not yet have dried out. Of course, I wouldn't want to do anything insensitive if Hagrid is upset, but if there's any way to procure some, I mean, it's almost impossible to get venom from an acromantula while it's alive. Slughorn seemed to be talking more to himself than Harry now. Seems an awful waste not to collect it. Might get 100 galleons a pint. To be frank, my salary is not large. And now Harry saw clearly what was to be done. Well, he said, with a most convincing hesitancy. Well, if you wanted to come, Professor, Hagrid would probably be really pleased. Give Aragog a better send-off, you know? Yes, of course, said Slughorn, his eyes now gleaming with enthusiasm. I tell you what, Harry, I'll meet you down there with a bottle or two. We'll drink the poor beast's, well, not health, but we'll send it off in style anyway, once it's buried, and I'll change my tie. This one is a little exuberant for the occasion. He bustled back into the castle, and Harry sped off to Hagrid's, delighted with himself. You came, croaked Hagrid, when he opened the door and saw Harry emerging from the invisibility cloak in front of him. Yeah, Ron and Hermione couldn't, though, said Harry. They're really sorry. Don't matter. He'd have been touched here, though, Harry. Hagrid gave a great sob. He had made himself a black armband out of what looked like a rag dipped in boot polish, and his eyes were puffy, red and swollen. Harry patted him consolingly on the elbow, which was the highest point of Hagrid he could easily reach. Where are we burying him? He asked. The forest? Blimey, no, said Hagrid, wiping his streaming eyes on the bottom of his shirt. The other spiders won't let me anywhere near their webs now Aragog's gone. Turns out he was only on his orders they didn't eat me. Can you believe that, Harry? The honest answer was yes. Harry recalled with painful ease the scene when he and Ron had come face to face with the acromantula. They had been quite clear that Aragog was the only thing that stopped them eating Hagrid. Never been in an area of the forest I couldn't go before, said Hagrid, shaking his head. It wasn't easy getting Aragog's body out of there, I can tell you. They usually eat their dead, you see, but I wanted to give him a nice burial, a proper send-off. He broke into sobs again, and Harry resumed the patting of his elbow, saying as he did so, for the potion seemed to indicate that it was the right thing to do, Professor Slughorn met me coming down here, Hagrid. Not in trouble, are you? Said Hagrid, looking up alarmed. You shouldn't be out of the castle in the evening. I know it's my fault. No. When he heard what I was doing, he said he'd like to come and pay his last respects to Aragog too, said Harry. He's gone to change into something more suitable, I think. And he said he'd bring some bottles so we can drink to Aragog's memory. Did he? Said Hagrid, looking both astonished and touched. That's right nice of him, that is. It's not turning you in either. I've never really had a lot to do with Horace Slughorn before. Coming to old Aragog, though, coming to see off old Aragog. Well, he'd have liked that, Aragog would. Harry thought privately that what Aragog would have liked most about Slughorn was the ample amount of edible flesh he provided, but he merely moved to the rear window of Hagrid's hut, where he saw the rather horrible sight of the enormous dead spider lying on its back, outside, its legs curled and tangled. Are we going to bury him here, Hagrid, in your garden? Just beyond the pumpkin patch, I thought, said Hagrid in a choked voice. I've already dug the, grave. Just thought we'd say a few nice things over him. Happy memories, His voice quivered and broke. There was a knock on the door, and he turned to answer it, blowing his nose on his great spotted handkerchief as he did so. Slughorn hurried over the threshold, several bottles in his arms and wearing a sombre black cravat. Hagrid, he said, in a deep grave voice, so very sorry to hear of your loss. That's very nice of you, said Hagrid. Thanks a lot, and thanks for not giving Harry detention neither. Wouldn't have dreamed of it, said Slughorn. Sad night, sad night. Where is the poor creature? Out here, said Hagrid in a shaky voice. Shall we do it then? The three of them stepped out into the back garden. The moon was glistening palely through the trees, and its rays mingled with the light spilling from Hagrid's window to illuminate Aragog's body lying on the edge of a massive pit, beside a 10-foot-high mound of freshly dug earth. Magnificent, said Slughorn, approaching the spider's head, where 8 milky eyes stared blankly at the sky, and 2 huge curved pincers shone, motionless in the moonlight. Harry thought he heard the tinkle of bottles as Slughorn bent over the pincers, apparently examining the enormous hairy head. It's not everyone appreciates how beautiful they are, said Hagrid to Slughorn's back, tears leaking from the corners of his crinkled eyes. I didn't know you were interested in creatures like Aragog, Horace. Interested? My dear Hagrid, I revere them, said Slughorn, stepping back from the body. Harry saw the glint of a bottle disappear beneath his cloak. though Hagrid, mopping his eyes once more, noticed nothing. "Now, shall we proceed to the burial?" Hagrid nodded and moved forwards. He heaved the gigantic spider into his arms and with an enormous grunt rolled it into the dark pit. It hit the bottom with a rather horrible crunchy thud. Hagrid started to cry again. "Of course, it's difficult for you, who knew him best," said Slughorn, who, like Harry, could reach no higher than Hagrid's elbow, but patted it all the same. "Why don't I say a few words?" He must have got a lot of good quality venom from Aragog, Harry thought, for Slughorn wore a satisfied smirk as he stepped up to the rim of the pit and said, in a low, impressive voice, "Farewell, Aragog, king of arachnids, whose long and faithful friendship those who knew you won't forget. Though your body will decay, your spirit lingers on in the quiet, web-spun places of your forest home. May your many-eyed descendants ever flourish, and your human friends find solace for the loss they have sustained." That was beautiful, howled Hagrid, and he collapsed onto the compost heap, crying harder than ever. There, said Slughorn, waving his wand so that the huge pile of earth rose up and then fell, with a muffled sort of crash onto the dead spider, forming a smooth mound. "Let's get inside and have a drink. Get on his other side, Harry. That's it. Up you come, Hagrid. Well done." They deposited Hagrid in a chair at the table. Fang, who had been skulking in his basket during the burial, now came padding softly across to them and put his heavy head into Harry's lap, as usual. Slughorn uncorked one of the bottles of wine he had brought. "I have had it all tested for poison," he assured Harry, pouring most of the first bottle into one of Hagrid's bucket-sized mugs and handing it to Hagrid. "Had a house elf taste every bottle after what happened to your poor friend Rupert." Harry saw in his mind's eye the expression on Hermione's face if she ever heard about this abuse of house elves, and decided never to mention it to her. "One for Harry," said Slughorn, dividing a second bottle between two mugs, "and one for me. Well," he raised his mug high, "to Aragog." "Aragog," said Harry and Hagrid together. Both Slughorn and Hagrid drank deeply. Harry, however, with the way ahead illuminated for him by Felix Felicis, knew that he must not drink, so he merely pretended to take a gulp and then set the mug back on the table before him. "I had him from an egg, you know," said Hagrid morosely. "Tiny little thing he was when he hatched, about the size of a Pekingese." "Sweet," said Slughorn. "Used to keep him in a cupboard up at the school until, well..." Hagrid's face darkened and Harry knew why. Tom Riddle had contrived to have Hagrid thrown out of school, blamed for opening the Chamber of Secrets. Slughorn, however, did not seem to be listening. He was looking up at the ceiling, from which a number of brass pots hung, and also a long silky skein of bright white hair. "That's never unicorn hair, Hagrid." "Oh, yeah," said Hagrid indifferently. "Gets pulled out of their tails. They catch it on branches and stuff in the forest, you know." "But, my dear chap, do you know how much that's worth?" "I use it for binding on bandages and stuff if a creature gets injured," said Hagrid, shrugging. "It's dead useful. Very strong, see?" Slughorn took another deep draught from his mug, his eyes moving carefully around the cabin now, looking, Harry knew, for more treasures that he might be able to convert into a plentiful supply of oak-matured mead. Crystallized pineapple and velvet smoking jackets. He refilled Hagrid's mug and his own and questioned him about the creatures that lived in the forest these days, and how Hagrid was able to look after them all. Hagrid, becoming expansive under the influence of the drink, and Slughorn's flattering interests, stopped mopping his eyes and entered happily into a long explanation of bow-truckle husbandry. The Felix Felicis gave Harry a little nudge at this point, and he noticed that the supply of drink that Slughorn had brought was running out fast. Harry had not yet managed to bring off the refilling charm without saying the incantation aloud, but the idea that he might be able to do it tonight was laughable. Indeed, Harry grinned to himself as unnoticed by either Hagrid or Slughorn, now swapping tales of the illegal trade in dragon eggs. He pointed his wand under the table at the emptying bottles, and they immediately began to refill. After an hour or so, Hagrid and Slughorn began making extravagant toasts to Hogwarts, to Dumbledore, to elf-made wine, and to... "Harry Potter!" bellowed Hagrid, slopping some of his 14th bucket of wine down his chin as he drained it. "Yes, indeed," cried Slughorn a little thickly. "Parryotta, the chosen boy who, well, something of that sort," he mumbled, and drained his mug too. Not long after this, Hagrid became tearful again, and pressed the whole unicorn tale upon Slughorn, who pocketed it with cries of, "To friendship! To generosity! To 10 galleons a hair!" And for a while after that, Hagrid and Slughorn were sitting side by side, arms around each other, singing a slow, sad song about a dying wizard called Odo. "Ah, the good die young," muttered Hagrid, slumping low onto the table, a little cross-eyed, while Slughorn continued to warble the refrain, "My dad was no age to go, nor were your mum and dad, Harry." Great fat tears oozed out of the corners of Hagrid's crinkled eyes again. He grasped Harry's arm and shook it. "Best wizard and witchard on their age I never knew. Terrible thing, terrible thing." Slughorn sang plaintively. "And Odo the hero, they bore him back home, to the place that he'd known as a lad. They laid him to rest with his hat inside out, and his wand snapped in two, which was sad." "Terrible," Hagrid grunted, and his great shaggy head rolled sideways onto his arms, and he fell asleep, snoring deeply. "Sorry," said Slughorn with a hiccup. "Can't carry a tune to save my life." "Hagrid wasn't talking about your singing," said Harry quietly. "He was talking about my mum and dad dying." "Oh," said Slughorn, repressing a large belch. "Oh dear, yes, that was terrible indeed. Terrible, terrible." He looked quite at loss for what to say and resorted to refilling their mugs. I don't suppose you remember it, Harry?" he asked awkwardly. "No, well, I was only 1 when they died," said Harry, his eyes on the flame of the candle, flickering in Hagrid's heavy snores. "But I found out pretty much what happened since. My dad died first. Did you know that?" I didn't," said Slughorn in a hushed voice. "Yeah, Voldemort murdered him, and then stepped over his body towards my mum," said Harry. Slughorn gave a great shudder, but he did not seem to be able to tear his horrified gaze away from Harry's face. "He told her to get out of the way," said Harry remorselessly. "He told me she needn't have died. He only wanted me. She could have run." "Oh dear," breathed Slughorn. "She could have. She needn't. That's awful." "It is, isn't it?" said Harry, in a voice barely more than a whisper. "But she didn't move. Dad was already dead. But she didn't want me to go too. She tried to plead with Voldemort, but he just laughed." "That's enough," said Slughorn suddenly, raising a shaking hand. "Really, my dear boy, enough. I'm an old man. I don't need to hear. I don't want to hear." "I forgot," lied Harry, Felix Felicis leading him on. "You liked her, didn't you?" "Liked her?" said Slughorn, his eyes brimming with tears once more. "I don't imagine anyone who met her wouldn't have liked her. Very brave, very funny. It was the most horrible thing." "But you won't help her son," said Harry. "She gave me her life, but you won't give me a memory." Hagrid's rumbling snores filled the cabin. Harry looked steadily into Slughorn's tear-filled eyes. The potions master seemed unable to look away. "Don't say that," he whispered. "It isn't a question. If it were to help you, of course, but no purpose can be served." "It can," said Harry clearly. "Dumbledore needs information. I need information." He knew he was safe. Felix was telling him that Slughorn would remember nothing of this in the morning. Looking Slughorn straight in the eye, Harry leant forwards a little. "I am the chosen one. I have to kill him. I need that memory." Slughorn turned paler than ever. His shiny forehead gleamed with sweat. "You are the chosen one?" "Of course I am," said Harry calmly. "But then, my dear boy, you're asking a great deal. You're asking me, in fact, to aid you in your attempt to destroy." "You don't want to get rid of the wizard who killed Lily Evans?" Harry, of course I do, but—" "You're scared he'll find out you helped me." Slughorn said nothing. He looked terrified. "Be brave like my mother, Professor." Slughorn raised a pudgy hand and pressed his shaking fingers to his mouth. He looked for a moment like an enormously overgrown baby. "I'm not proud," he whispered through his fingers. "I'm ashamed of what that memory shows. I think I may have done great damage that day." "You'd cancel out anything you did by giving me that memory," said Harry. "It would be a very brave and noble thing to do." Hagrid twitched in his sleep and snored on. Slughorn and Harry stared at each other over the guttering candle. There was a long, long silence, but Felix Felicis told Harry not to break it, to wait. Then, very slowly, Slughorn put his hand in his pocket and pulled out his wand. He put his other hand inside his cloak and took out a small empty bottle. Still looking into Harry's eyes, Slughorn touched the tip of his wand to his temple and withdrew it, so that a long silver thread of memory came away too, clinging to the wand tip. Longer and longer the memory stretched until it broke and swung, silvery bright, from the wand. Slughorn lowered it into the bottle where it coiled, then spread, swirling like gas. He corked the bottle with a trembling hand and then passed it across the table to Harry. "Thank you very much, Professor." "You're a good boy," said Professor Slughorn, tears trickling down his fat cheeks into his walrus moustache. "And you've got her eyes. Just don't think too badly of me once you've seen it." And he too put his head on his arms, gave a deep sigh, and fell asleep. Chapter 23. Horcruxes. Harry could feel the Felix Felicis wearing off as he crept back into the castle. The front door had remained unlocked for him, but on the third floor he met Peeves and only narrowly avoided detection by diving sideways through one of his shortcuts. By the time he got up to the portrait of the fat lady and pulled off his invisibility cloak, he was not surprised to find her in a most unhelpful mood. "What sort of time do you call this?" "I'm really sorry. I had to go out for something important." "Well, the password changed at midnight, so you'll just have to sleep in the corridor, won't you?" "You're joking," said Harry. "Why did it have to change at midnight?" "That's the way it is," said the fat lady. "If you're angry, go and take it up with the headmaster. He's the one who's tightened security." "Fantastic," said Harry bitterly, looking around at the hard door. "Really brilliant. Yeah, I would go and take it up with Dumbledore if he was here, because he's the one who wanted me to—" "He is here," said a voice behind Harry. "Professor Dumbledore returned to the school an hour ago." Nearly headless Nick was gliding towards Harry, his head wobbling as usual upon his ruff. "I had it from the bloody Baron, who saw him arrive," said Nick. "He appeared, according to the Baron, to be in good spirits, though a little tired, of course." "Where is he?" said Harry, his heart leaping. "Oh, groaning and clanking up to the astronomy tower. It's a favourite pastime of his." "Not the bloody Baron, Dumbledore." "Oh, in his office," said Nick. "I believe, from what the Baron said, that he had business to attend to before turning in." "Yeah, he has," said Harry, excitement blazing in his chest at the prospect of telling Dumbledore he had secured the memory. He wheeled about and sprinted off again, ignoring the fat lady who was calling after him. "Come back! All right, I lied. I was annoyed you woke me up. The password's still tapeworm." But Harry was already hurtling back along the corridor, and within minutes he was saying "Toffee eclairs" to Dumbledore's gargoyle, which leapt aside, permitting Harry entrance onto the spiral staircase. "Enter," said Dumbledore when Harry knocked. He sounded exhausted. Harry pushed open the door. There was Dumbledore's office, looking the same as ever, but with black, star-strewn skies beyond the windows. "Good gracious, Harry," said Dumbledore in surprise. "To what do I owe this very late pleasure?" "Sir, I've got it. I've got the memory from Slughorn." Harry pulled out the tiny glass bottle and showed it to Dumbledore. For a moment or two, the headmaster looked stunned. Then his face split in a wide smile. "Harry, this is spectacular news. Very well done indeed. I knew you could do it." All thought of the lateness of the hour apparently forgotten, he hurriedly opened around his desk, took the bottle with Slughorn's memory in his uninjured hand, and strode over to the cabinet where he kept the pensieve. "And now," said Dumbledore, placing the stone basin upon his desk and emptying the contents of the bottle into it. "Now at last we shall see, Harry. Quickly." Harry bowed obediently over the pensieve and felt his feet leave the office floor. Once again he fell through darkness and landed in Horace Slughorn's office many years before. There was the much younger Horace Slughorn, with his thick, shiny, straw-coloured hair and his gingery blonde moustache, sitting again in the comfortable winged armchair in his office, his feet resting upon a velvet pouf, a small glass of wine in one hand, the other rummaging in a box of crystallised pineapple. And there were the half a dozen teenage boys sitting around Slughorn with Tom Riddle in the midst of them, Marvolo's gold and black ring gleaming on his finger. Dumbledore landed beside Harry, just as Riddle asked, "Sir, is it true that Professor Merrythought is retiring?" Tom, if I knew, I couldn't tell you," said Slughorn, wagging his finger reprovingly at Riddle, though winking at the same time. "I must say I'd like to know where you get your information, boy. More knowledgeable than half the staff you are." Riddle smiled. The other boys laughed and cast him admiring looks. "What with your uncanny ability to know things you shouldn't, and your careful flattery of the people who matter— thank you for the pineapple, by the way. You're quite right, it is my favourite." Several of the boys tittered again. "I confidently expect you to rise to Minister for Magic within 20 years, 15 if you keep sending me top pineapple. I have excellent contacts at the Ministry." Tom Riddle merely smiled as the others laughed again. Harry noticed that he was by no means the eldest of the group of boys, but that they all seemed to look to him as their leader. "I don't know that politics would suit me, sir," he said when the laughter had died away. "I don't have the right kind of background, for one thing." A couple of the boys around him smirked at each other. Harry was sure they were enjoying a private joke, undoubtedly about what they knew or suspected regarding their gang leader's famous ancestor. Nonsense, said Slughorn briskly. Couldn't be plainer you come from decent wizarding stock, abilities like yours. No, you'll go far, Tom. I've never been wrong about a student yet. The small golden clock standing upon Slughorn's desk chimed 11 o'clock behind him, and he looked around. Good gracious, is that the time already? You'd better get going, boys, or we'll be all in trouble. Lestrange, I want your essay by tomorrow or it's detention. Same goes for you, Avery. One by one the boys filed out of the room. Slughorn heaved himself out of his armchair and carried his empty glass over to his desk. A movement behind him made him look around. Riddle was still standing there. Look sharp, Tom. You don't want to be caught out of bed out of hours. And you a prefect. Sir, I wanted to ask you something. Ask away then, my boy, ask away. Sir, I wondered what you know about Horcruxes. Slughorn stared at him, his thick fingers absent-mindedly caressing the stem of his wine-glass. Project for defence against the dark arts, is it? But Harry could tell that Slughorn knew perfectly well that this was not schoolwork. Not exactly, sir, said Riddle. I came across the term while reading, and I didn't really fully understand it. No, well, you'd be hard-pushed to find a book at Hogwarts that'll give you details on Horcruxes, Tom. That's very dark stuff, very dark indeed, said Slughorn. But you obviously know all about them, sir. I mean, a wizard like you. Sorry, I mean, if you can't tell me, obviously. I just knew if anyone could tell me, you could. So I just thought I'd ask. It was very well done, thought Harry. The hesitancy, the casual tone, the careful flattery, none of it overdone. He, Harry, had had too much experience of trying to wheedle information out of reluctant people not to recognise a master at work. He could tell that Riddle wanted the information very, very much, perhaps had been working towards this moment for weeks. Well, said Slughorn, not looking at Riddle but fiddling with the ribbon on top of his box of crystallised pineapple. Well, it can't hurt to give you an overview, of course, just so that you understand the term. A Horcrux is the word used for an object in which a person has concealed part of their soul. I don't quite understand how that works, though, sir, said Riddle. His voice was carefully controlled, but Harry could sense his excitement. Well, you split your soul, you see, said Slughorn, and hide part of it in an object outside the body. Then, even if one's body is attacked or destroyed, one cannot die, for part of the soul remains earthbound and undamaged. But of course, existence in such a form... Slughorn's face crumpled, and Harry found himself remembering words he had heard nearly 2 years before. I was ripped from my body. I was less than spirit, less than the meanest ghost, but still I was alive. Few would want it, Tom. Very few. Death would be preferable. But Riddle's hunger was now apparent. His expression was greedy. He could no longer hide his longing. How do you split your soul? Well, said Slughorn uncomfortably, you must understand that the soul is supposed to remain intact and whole. Splitting it is an act of violation. It is against nature. But how do you do it? By an act of evil. The supreme act of evil, by committing murder. Killing rips the soul apart. The wizard intent upon creating a Horcrux would use the damage to his advantage. He would encase the torn portion. Encase. But how? There is a spell. Do not ask me, I don't know, said Slughorn, shaking his head like an old elephant bothered by mosquitoes. Do I look as though I have tried it? Do I look like a killer? No, sir, of course not, said Riddle quickly. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend. Not at all, not at all, not offended, said Slughorn gruffly. It's natural to feel some curiosity about these things. Wizards of a certain calibre have always been drawn to that aspect of magic. Yes, sir, said Riddle. What I don't understand, though, just out of curiosity, I mean, would one Horcrux be much use? Can you only split your soul once? Wouldn't it be better, make you stronger, to have your soul in more pieces? I mean, for instance, isn't 7 the most powerful magic number? Wouldn't 7? Merlin's beard, Tom, yelped Slughorn. 7? Isn't it bad enough to think of killing one person? And in any case, bad enough to divide the soul, but to rip it into 7 pieces? Slughorn looked deeply troubled now. He was gazing at Riddle, as though he had never seen him plainly before, and Harry could tell that he was regretting entering into the conversation at all. Of course, he muttered. This is all hypothetical, what we're discussing, isn't it? All academic. Yes, sir, of course, said Riddle quickly. But all the same, Tom, keep it quiet. What I've told, that's to say, what we've discussed. People wouldn't like to think we've been chatting about Horcruxes. It's a banned subject at Hogwarts, you know. Dumbledore's particularly fierce about it. I won't say a word, sir, said Riddle, and he left, but not before Harry had glimpsed his face, which was full of that same wild happiness it had worn when he had first found out that he was a wizard, the sort of happiness that did not enhance his handsome features but made them somehow less human. Thank you, Harry, said Dumbledore quietly. Let us go. When Harry landed back on the office floor, Dumbledore was already sitting down behind his desk. Harry sat too, and waited for Dumbledore to speak.
"I have been hoping for this piece of evidence for a very long time," said Dumbledore at last. "It confirms the theory on which I have been working. It tells me that I am right, and also how very far there is still to go."
Harry suddenly noticed that every single one of the old headmasters and headmistresses in the portraits around the walls was awake and listening into their conversation. A corpulent, red-nosed wizard had actually taken out an ear trumpet.
"Well, Harry," said Dumbledore, "I'm sure you understood the significance of what we just heard. At the same age as you are now, give or take a few months, Tom Riddle was doing all he could to find out how to make himself immortal."
"You think he succeeded then, sir?" asked Harry. "He made a Horcrux, and that's why he didn't die when he attacked me. He had a Horcrux hidden somewhere. A bit of his soul was safe."
"A bit, or more," said Dumbledore. "You heard Voldemort. What he particularly wanted from Horace was an opinion on what would happen to the wizard who created more than one Horcrux. What would happen to the wizard so determined to evade death that he would be prepared to murder many times, rip his soul repeatedly, so as to store it in many separately concealed Horcruxes. No book would have given him that information. As far as I know, as far as I am sure, as Voldemort knew, no wizard had ever done more than tear his soul in two."
Dumbledore paused for a moment, marshalling his thoughts, and then said,
4 years ago, I received what I considered certain proof that Voldemort had split his soul."
"Where?" asked Harry. "How?"
"You handed it to me, Harry," said Dumbledore. "The diary, Riddle's diary, the one giving instructions on how to reopen the Chamber of Secrets."
"I don't understand, sir," said Harry.
"Well, although I did not see the Riddle who came out of the diary, what you described to me was a phenomenon I had never witnessed. A mere memory, starting to act and think for itself. A mere memory, sapping the life out of the girl into whose hands it had fallen. No, something much more sinister had lived inside that book. A fragment of soul, I was almost sure of it. The diary had been a Horcrux, but this raised as many questions as it answered. What intrigued and alarmed me most was that the diary had been intended as a weapon, as much as a safeguard."
"I still don't understand," said Harry.
"Well, it worked as a Horcrux. It's supposed to work. In other words, the fragment of soul concealed itself. It was kept safe and has undoubtedly played its part in preventing the death of its owner. But there could be no doubt that Riddle really wanted that diary read, wanted the piece of his soul to inhabit or possess somebody else, so that Slytherin's monster would be unleashed again."
"Well, he didn't want his hard work to be wasted," said Harry. "He wanted people to know he was Slytherin's heir, because he couldn't take credit at the time."
"Quite correct," said Dumbledore, nodding. "But you don't see, Harry, that if he intended the diary to be passed to or planted on some future Hogwarts student, he was being remarkably blasé about the precious fragment of his soul concealed within it. The point of a Horcrux is, as Professor Slughorn explained, to keep part of the self hidden and safe, not to fling it into somebody else's path and run the risk that they might destroy it. As indeed happened, that particular fragment of soul is no more. You saw that. The careless way in which Voldemort regarded this Horcrux seemed most ominous to me. It suggested that he must have made, or been planning to make, more Horcruxes, so that the loss of the first would not be too detrimental. I did not wish to believe it, but nothing else seemed to make sense. Then you told me 2 years later that on the night that Voldemort returned to his body, he made a most illuminating and alarming statement to his Death Eaters. I, who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality. That was what you told me, he said, further than anybody, and I thought I knew what that meant, though the Death Eaters did not. He was referring to his Horcruxes. Horcruxes in the plural, Harry, which I do not believe any other wizard has ever had. Yet it fitted. Lord Voldemort had seemed to grow less human with the passing years, and the transformation he had undergone seemed to me to be the only explicable of his soul. It was mutilated beyond the realms of what we might call usual evil."
"So he's made himself impossible to kill by murdering other people," said Harry. "Why couldn't he make a Philosopher's Stone or steal one if he was so interested in immortality?"
"Well, we know that he tried to do just that 5 years ago," said Dumbledore. "But there are several reasons why I think a Philosopher's Stone would appeal less than Horcruxes to Lord Voldemort. While the elixir of life does indeed extend life, it must be drunk regularly, for all eternity, if the drinker is to maintain his immortality. Therefore, Voldemort would be entirely dependent on the elixir, and if it ran out, or was contaminated, or if the stone was stolen, he would die just like any other man. Voldemort likes to operate alone, remember. I believe that he would have found the thought of being dependent, even on the elixir, intolerable. Of course, he was prepared to drink it if it would take him out of the horrible part life to which he was condemned after attacking you, but only to regain a body. Thereafter, I am convinced he intended to continue to rely on his Horcruxes. He would need nothing more. If only he could regain a human form. He was already immortal, you see, or as close to immortal as any man can be. But now, Harry, armed with this information, the crucial memory you have succeeded in procuring for us, we are closer to the secret of finishing Lord Voldemort than anyone has ever been before. You heard him, Harry. Wouldn't it be better, make you stronger, to have your soul in more places? Isn't 7 the most powerful magical number? Isn't 7 the most powerfully magic number? Yes, I think the idea of a 7-part soul would greatly appeal to Lord Voldemort.
He made 7 Horcruxes, said Harry, horror-struck, with several of the portraits on the walls which made similar noises of shock and outrage. But they could be anywhere in the world, hidden, buried, or invisible.
I'm glad you appreciate the magnitude of the problem, said Dumbledore calmly. But firstly, no, Harry, not 7 Horcruxes, 6. The 7th part of his soul, however maimed, resides inside his regenerated body. That was the part of him that lived a spectral existence for so many years during his exile. Without that, he has no self at all. That 7th piece of soul will be the last that anybody wishing to kill Voldemort must attack, the piece that lives in his body.
But the 6 Horcruxes, then, said Harry, a little desperately. How are we supposed to find them?
You are forgetting. You have already destroyed one of them, and I have destroyed another.
You have, said Harry eagerly.
Yes, indeed,
said Dumbledore, as he raised his blackened, burned-looking hand.
The ring, Harry, Marvolo's ring, and a terrible curse there was upon it too. Had it not been, forgive me the lack of seemly modesty, for my own prodigious skill, and for Professor Snape's timely action when I returned to Hogwarts, desperately injured, I might not have lived to tell the tale. However, a withered hand does not seem an unreasonable exchange for a 7th of Voldemort's soul. The ring is no longer a Horcrux.
But how did you find it?
Well, as you now know, I have made it my business for many years to discover as much as I can about Voldemort's past life. I have travelled widely, visiting those places he once knew. I stumbled across the ring hidden in the ruin of the Gaunt's house. It seems that once Voldemort had succeeded in sealing a piece of his soul inside it, he did not want to wear it any more. He hid it, protected by many powerful enchantments, in the shack where his ancestors had once lived. Morphin, having been carted off to Azkaban, of course, never guessing that I might one day take the trouble to visit the ruin, or that I might be keeping an eye open for traces of magical concealment. However, we should not congratulate ourselves too heartily. You destroy the diary, and I the ring. But if we are right in our theory of a 7-part soul, 4 Horcruxes remain.
And they could be anything, said Harry. They could be old tin cans or, I don't know, empty potion bottles.
You are thinking of portkeys, Harry, which must be ordinary objects, easy to overlook. But Lord Voldemort used tin cans or old potion bottles to guard his own precious soul. You are forgetting what I have shown you. Lord Voldemort liked to collect trophies, and he preferred objects with a powerful magical history. His pride, his belief in his own superiority, his determination to carve for himself a startling place in magical history. These things suggest to me that Voldemort would have chosen his Horcruxes with some care, favouring objects worthy of the honour.
The diary wasn't that special.
The diary, as you have said yourself, was proof that he was the heir of Slytherin. I am sure that Voldemort considered it of stupendous importance.
So, the other Horcruxes, said Harry. Do you think you know what they are, sir?
I can only guess, said Dumbledore. For the reasons I have already given, I believe that Lord Voldemort would prefer objects that in themselves have a certain grandeur. I have therefore trawled back through Voldemort's past to see if I can find evidence that such artefacts have disappeared around him.
The locket, said Harry loudly. Hufflepuff's cup.
Yes, said Dumbledore, smiling. I would be prepared to bet, perhaps not my other hand, but a couple of fingers, that they became Horcruxes 3 and 4. The remaining 2, assuming again that he created a total of 6, are more of a problem. But I will hazard a guess that, having secured objects from Hufflepuff and Slytherin, he set out to track down objects owned by Gryffindor or Ravenclaw. 4 objects from the 4 founders would, I am sure, have exerted a powerful pull over Voldemort's imagination. I cannot answer for whether he ever managed to find anything of Ravenclaw's. I am confident, however, that the only known relic of Gryffindor remains safe.
Dumbledore pointed his blackened fingers to the wall behind him, where a ruby-encrusted sword reposed within a glass case. Do you think that's why he really wanted to come back to Hogwarts, sir? Said Harry, to try and find something from one of the other founders.
My thoughts precisely, said Dumbledore, but unfortunately that does not advance us much further, for he was turned away, or so I believe, without the chance to search the school. I am forced to conclude that he never fulfilled his ambition of collecting 4 founders' objects. He definitely had 2. He may have found 3. That is the best we can do for now. Even if he got something of Ravenclaw's, or of Gryffindor's, that leaves us 6 Horcrux, said Harry, counting on his fingers. Unless he got both. I don't think so, said Dumbledore. I think I know what the 6th Horcrux is. I wonder what you will say when I confess that I have been curious for a while about the behaviour of the snake, Nagini.
The snake, said Harry, startled. You can use animals as Horcruxes.
Well, it's an inadvisable thing to do, said Dumbledore, because to confide a part of your soul to something that can think and move for itself is obviously a very risky business. However, if my calculations are correct, Voldemort was still at least 1 Horcrux short of his goal of 6 when he entered your parents' house with the intention of killing you. He seems to have reserved the process of making Horcruxes for particularly significant deaths. You would certainly have been that. He believed that in killing you, he was destroying the danger the prophecy had outlined. He believed he was making himself invincible. I'm sure that he was intending to make his final Horcrux with your death. As we know, he failed. After an interval of some years, however, he used Nagini to kill an old Muggle man, and it might then have occurred to him to turn her into a last Horcrux. She underlines the Slytherin connection, which enhances Lord Voldemort's mystique. I think he is perhaps as fond of her as he can be of anything. He certainly likes to keep her close, and he seems to have an unusual amount of control over her, even for a Parselmouth.
So, said Harry, the diary's gone, the ring's gone, the cup, the locket and the snake are still intact, and you think there might be a Horcrux that was once Ravenclaw's or Gryffindor's?
An admirably succinct and accurate summary, yes, said Dumbledore, bowing his head.
So, are you still looking for them, sir? Is that where you've been going when you've been leaving the school?
Correct, said Dumbledore. I have been looking for a very long time, I think. Perhaps I may be close to finding another one. There are hopeful signs.
And if you do, said Harry quickly, can I come with you and help get rid of it? Dumbledore looked at Harry very intently for a moment before saying,
Yes, I think so.
I can, said Harry, thoroughly taken aback.
Oh, yes, said Dumbledore, smiling slightly. I think you have earned that right.
Harry felt his heart lift. It was very good not to hear words of caution and protection for once. The headmasters and headmistresses around the walls seemed less impressed by Dumbledore's decision. Harry saw a few of them shaking their heads, and Phineas Nicholas actually snorted. Does Voldemort know when a Horcrux is destroyed, sir? Can he feel it? Harry asked, ignoring the portraits.
A very interesting question, Harry. I believe not. I believe that Voldemort is now so immersed in evil, and those crucial parts of himself have been detached for so long, he does not feel as we do. Perhaps at the point of death he might be aware of his loss, but he was not aware, for instance, that the diary had been destroyed until he forced the truth out of Lucius Malfoy. When Voldemort discovered that the diary had been mutilated and robbed of all its powers, I am told that his anger was terrible to behold.
But I thought he meant Lucius Malfoy to smuggle it into Hogwarts.
Yes, he did years ago, when he was sure he would be able to create more Horcruxes. But still Lucius was supposed to wait for Voldemort's say-so, and he never received it, for Voldemort vanished shortly after giving him the diary. No doubt he thought that Lucius would not dare do anything with a Horcrux other than guard it carefully, but he was counting too much upon Lucius's fear of a master who had been gone for years, and whom Lucius believed dead. Of course, Lucius did not know what the diary really was. I understand that Voldemort had told him the diary would cause the Chamber of Secrets to reopen, because it was cleverly enchanted. Had Lucius known he had a portion of his master's soul in his hands, he would undoubtedly have treated it with more reverence. But instead he went ahead and carried out the old plan for his own ends, by planting the diary upon Arthur Weasley's daughter. He hoped to discredit Arthur, have me thrown out of Hogwarts, and get rid of a highly incriminating object in one stroke. Ah, poor Lucius! What with Voldemort's fury about the fact that he threw away the Horcrux for his own gain, and the fiasco at the Ministry last year, I would not be surprised if he is secretly glad to be safe in Azkaban at the moment."
Harry sat in thought for a moment, and then asked, "So, if all of his Horcruxes are destroyed, Voldemort could be killed?"
"Yes, I think so," said Dumbledore. "Without his Horcruxes, Voldemort will be a mortal man with a maimed and diminished soul. Never forget, though, that while his soul may be damaged beyond repair, his brain and his magical power remain intact. It will take uncommon skill and power to kill a wizard like Voldemort, even without his Horcruxes."
"But I haven't got uncommon skill and power," said Harry, before he could stop himself.
"Yes, you have," said Dumbledore firmly. "You have a power that Voldemort has never had. You can—"
"I know," said Harry impatiently. "I can love." It was only with difficulty that he stopped himself, adding, "Big deal."
"Yes, Harry, you can love," said Dumbledore, who looked as though he knew perfectly well that Harry had just refrained from saying, "which, given everything that has happened to you, is a great and remarkable thing. You are still too young to understand how unusual you are, Harry."
"So when the prophecy says that I'll have power the Dark Lord knows not, it just means love?" asked Harry, feeling a little let down.
"Yes, just love," said Dumbledore. "But Harry, never forget that what the prophecy says is only significant because Voldemort made it so. I told you this at the end of last year. Voldemort singled you out as the person who would be most dangerous to him, and in doing so, he made you the person who would be most dangerous to him."
"But it comes to the same."
"No, it doesn't,"
said Dumbledore, sounding impatient now. Pointing at Harry with his black, withered hand, he said,
"You are setting too much store by the prophecy."
"But," spluttered Harry, "but you said the prophecy means—"
"If Voldemort had never heard the prophecy, would it have been fulfilled? Would it have meant anything? Of course not. Do you think every prophecy in the Hall of Prophecy has been fulfilled?"
"But," said Harry, bewildered, "but last year you said one of us would have to kill the other."
Harry, only because Voldemort made a grave error and acted on Professor Trelawney's words. If Voldemort had never murdered your father, would he have imparted in you a furious desire for revenge? Of course not. If he had not forced your mother to die for you, would he have given you a magical protection that he could not penetrate? Of course not. Harry, don't you see? Voldemort himself created his worst enemy, just as tyrants everywhere do. Have you any idea how much tyrants fear the people they oppress? All of them realize that one day, amongst the many victims, there is sure to be one who rises against them and strikes back. Voldemort is no different. Always he is on the lookout for the one who would challenge him. He heard the prophecy, and he leapt into action, with the result that he not only hand-picked the man most likely to finish him, he handed him uniquely deadly weapons. "But it is essential that you understand this," said Dumbledore, standing up and striding about the room, his glittering robes swooshing in his wake. Harry had never seen him so agitated. "By attempting to kill you, Voldemort himself singled out the remarkable person who sits here in front of me, and gave him the tools for the job. It is Voldemort's fault that you were able to see into his thoughts, his ambitions, that you even understand the snake-like language in which he gives orders. And yet, Harry, despite your privileged insight into Voldemort's world, which, incidentally, is a gift any Death Eater would kill to have, you have never been seduced by the dark arts, never, even for a second, shown the slightest desire to become one of Voldemort's followers."
"Of course I haven't," said Harry indignantly. "He killed my mum and dad."
"You are protected, in short, by your ability to love," said Dumbledore loudly. "The only protection that can possibly work against the lure of power like Voldemort's. In spite of all the temptation you have endured, all the suffering, you remain pure of heart, just as pure as you were at the age of 11, when you stared into a mirror that reflected your heart's desire, and it showed you only the way to thwart Lord Voldemort, and not immortality or riches. Harry, have you any idea how few wizards could have seen what you saw in that mirror? Voldemort should have known then what he was dealing with, but he did not."
"But he knows it now."
"You have flitted into Lord Voldemort's mind without damage to yourself, but he cannot possess you without enduring mortal agony, as he discovered in the Ministry. I do not think he understands why, Harry, but he was in such a hurry to mutilate his own soul, he never paused to understand the incomparable power of a soul that is untarnished and whole."
"But, sir," said Harry, making valiant efforts not to sound argumentative, "it all comes to the same thing, doesn't it? I've got to try and kill him, or—"
"Got to?" said Dumbledore. "Of course you've got to, but not because of the prophecy, because you yourself will never rest until you've tried. We both know it. Imagine, please, just for a moment, that you had never heard that prophecy. How would you feel about Voldemort now? Think."
Harry watched Dumbledore striding up and down in front of him and thought. He thought of his mother, his father and Sirius. He thought of Cedric Diggory. He thought of all the terrible deeds he knew Lord Voldemort had done. A flame seemed to leap inside his chest, searing his throat. "I'd want him finished," said Harry quietly. "I'd want to do it."
"Of course you would," cried Dumbledore. "You see, the prophecy does not mean you have to do anything, but the prophecy caused Lord Voldemort to mark you as his equal. In other words, you are free to choose your way, quite free to turn your back on the prophecy. But Voldemort continues to set store by the prophecy. He will continue to hunt you, which makes it certain, really, that
one of us is going to end up killing the other," said Harry. Yes. But he understood at last what Dumbledore had been trying to tell him. It was, he thought, the difference between being dragged into the arena to face a battle to the death and walking into the arena with your head held high. Some people, perhaps, would say that there was little to choose between the two ways, but Dumbledore knew, and so do I, thought Harry, with a rush of fierce pride, and so did my parents, that there was all the difference in the world. Chapter 24. Sectum Sempra. Exhausted but delighted with his night's work, Harry told Ron and Hermione everything that had happened during next morning's charms lesson, having first cast the Muffliato spell upon those nearest them. They were both satisfyingly impressed by the way he had wheedled the memory out of Slughorn, and positively awed when he told them about Voldemort's Horcruxes and Dumbledore's promise to take Harry along, should he find another one. "Wow," said Ron, when Harry had finally finished telling them everything. Ron was waving his wand very vaguely in the direction of the ceiling, without paying the slightest bit of attention to what he was doing. "Wow, you're actually going to go with Dumbledore and try and destroy? Wow!" "Ron, you're making it snow," said Hermione patiently, grabbing his wrist and redirecting his wand away from the ceiling, from which, sure enough, large white flakes had started to fall. Lavender Brown, Harry noticed, glared at Hermione from a neighbouring table, through very red eyes, and Hermione immediately let go of Ron's arm. "Oh yeah," said Ron, looking down at his shoulders in vague surprise. "Sorry, looks like we've all got horrible dandruff now." He brushed some of the fake snow off Hermione's shoulder. Lavender burst into tears. Ron looked immensely guilty and turned his back on her. "We split up," he told Harry out of the corner of his mouth, "last night, when she saw me coming out of the dormitory with Hermione. Obviously she couldn't see you, so she thought it had just been the two of us." "Ah," said Harry. "Well, you don't mind it's over, do you?" "No," Ron admitted. "It was pretty bad while she was yelling, but at least I didn't have to finish it." "Coward," said Hermione, though she looked amused. "Well, it was a bad night for romance all around. Ginny and Dean split up too, Harry." Harry thought there was a rather knowing look in her eye as she told him that, but she could not possibly know that his insides were suddenly dancing the conga. Keeping his face as immobile and his voice as indifferent as he could, he asked, "How come?" "Oh, something really silly. She said he was always trying to help her through the portrait hole, like she couldn't climb in herself, but they've been a bit rocky for ages." Harry glanced over at Dean on the other side of the classroom. He certainly looked unhappy. "Of course, this puts you in a bit of a dilemma, doesn't it?" said Hermione. "What do you mean?" said Harry quickly. "The Quidditch team," said Hermione. "If Ginny and Dean aren't speaking." Oh yeah," said Harry. "Flitwick," said Ron in a warning tone. The tiny little charms master was bobbing his way towards them, and Hermione was the only one who had managed to turn vinegar into wine. Her glass flask was full of deep crimson liquid, whereas the contents of Harry's and Ron's were still murky brown. Now, boys," squeaked Professor Flitwick reproachfully. "A little less talk, a little more action. Let me see you try." Together they raised their hands, concentrating with all their might, and pointed them at their flasks. Harry's vinegar turned to ice. Ron's flask exploded. "Yes, for homework," said Professor Flitwick, re-emerging from under the table and pulling the shards of glass out of the top of his hat. "Practice!" They had one of their rare joint-free periods after charms, and walked back to the common room together. Ron seemed to be positively light-hearted about the end of his relationship with Lavender, and Hermione seemed cheery too, though when asked what she was grinning about, she simply said, "It's a nice day." Neither of them seemed to have noticed that a fierce battle was raging inside Harry's brain. "She's Ron's sister." "But she's ditched Dean." "She's still Ron's sister." "I'm his mate." "They'll make it worse." "If I talked to him first, he'd hit you." "What if I don't care? He's your best mate." Harry barely noticed that they were climbing through the portrait hole into the sunny common room, and only vaguely registered the small group of seventh years clustered together there, until Hermione cried, "Katie, you're back. Are you okay?" Harry stared. It was indeed Katie Bell, looking completely healthy and surrounded by her jubilant friends. I'm really well, she said happily. They let me out of St Mungo's on Monday, had a couple of days at home with Mum and Dad, and then came back here this morning. Leanne was just telling me about McLagan and the last match, Harry. Yes, said Harry. Well, now you're back and Ron's fit, we'll have a decent chance of thrashing Ravenclaw, which means we could still be in the running for the cup. Listen, Katie. He had to put the question to her at once. His curiosity even drove Ginny temporarily from his brain. He dropped his voice as Katie's friends started gathering up their things. Apparently they were late for Transfiguration. That necklace. Can you remember who gave it to you now? No, said Katie, shaking her head ruefully. Everyone's been asking me, but I haven't got a clue. The last thing I remember was walking into the ladies in the free broomsticks. You definitely went into the bathroom then, said Hermione. Well, I know I pushed open the door, said Katie, so I suppose whoever imperiorised me was standing just behind it. After that, my memory's blank, until about 2 weeks ago in St Mungo's. Listen, I'd better go. I wouldn't put it past McGonagall to give me lines even if it's my first day back. She caught up her bag and books and hurried after her friends, leaving Harry, Ron and Hermione to sit down at a window table and ponder what she had told them. So, it must have been a girl or a woman who gave Katie the necklace, said Hermione, to be in the ladies' bathroom. Or someone who looked like a girl or a woman, said Harry. Don't forget, there was a cauldron full of polyjuice potion at Hogwarts. We know some of it got stolen. In his mind's eye, he watched a parade of crabs and goyles prance past, all transformed into girls. I think I'm going to take another swig of Felix, said Harry, and have a go at the Room of Requirement again. That would be a complete waste of potions, said Hermione flatly, putting down the copy of Spellman's syllabary she had just taken out of her bag. Luck can only get you so far, Harry. The situation with Slughorn was different. You always had the ability to persuade him. You just needed to tweak the circumstances a bit. Luck isn't enough to get you through a powerful enchantment, though. Don't go wasting the rest of that potion. You'll need all the luck you can get if Dumbledore takes you along with him. She dropped her voice to a whisper. Couldn't we make some more? Ron asked Harry, ignoring Hermione. It'd be great to have a stock of it. Have a look in the book. Harry pulled the copy of Advanced Potion Making out of his bag and looked up Felix Felicis. Blimey, it's seriously complicated, he said, running an eye down the list of ingredients. And it takes 6 months. You've got to let it stew. Typical, said Ron. Harry was about to put his book away when he noticed the corner of a page folded down. Turning to it, he saw the Sectum Sempra spell, captioned For Enemies, that he had marked a few weeks previously. He had still not found out what it did, mainly because he did not want to test it around Hermione, but he was considering trying it out on McLagan next time he came up behind him unawares. The only person who was not particularly pleased to see Katie Bell back at school was Dean Thomas, because he would no longer be required to fill her place as chaser. He took the blow stoically enough when Harry told him, merely grunting and shrugging, but Harry had the distinct feeling as he walked away that Dean and Seamus were muttering mutinously behind his back. The following fortnight saw the best Quidditch practices Harry had known as captain. His team was so pleased to be rid of McLagan, so glad to have Katie back at last, that they were flying extremely well. Ginny did not seem at all upset about the breakup with Dean. On the contrary, she was the life and soul of the team, her imitations of Ron anxiously bobbing up and down in front of the goalposts as the quaffle sped towards him, or of Harry bellowing orders at McLagan before being knocked out cold, kept them all highly amused. Harry, laughing with the others, was glad to have an innocent reason to look at Ginny. He had received several more bludger injuries during practice because he had not been keeping his eyes on the snitch. The battle still raged inside his head, Ginny or Ron. Sometimes he thought that the post-lavender Ron might not mind too much if he asked Ginny out, but then he remembered Ron's expression when he had seen her kissing Dean, and was sure that Ron would consider it base treachery if Harry so much as held her hand. Yet Harry could not help himself talking to Ginny, laughing with her, walking back from practice with her. However much his conscience ached, he found himself wondering how best to get her off on her own. It would have been ideal if Slughorn had given another of his little parties, for Ron would not be around. But unfortunately, Slughorn seemed to have given them up. Once or twice Harry considered asking for Hermione's help, but he did not think he could stand seeing the smug look on her face. He thought he caught it sometimes when Hermione spotted him staring at Ginny, or laughing at her jokes, and to complicate matters, he had the nagging worry that if he didn't do it, somebody else was sure to ask Ginny out soon. He and Ron were at least agreed on the fact that she was too popular for her own good. All in all, the temptation to take another gulp of Felix Felicis was becoming stronger by the day, for surely this was a case for, as Hermione put it, tweaking the circumstances. The balmy days slid gently through May, and Ron seemed to be there at Harry's shoulder every time he saw Ginny. Harry found himself longing for a stroke of luck that would somehow cause Ron to realise that something would make him happier than his best friend and his sister falling for each other, and to leave them alone together for longer than a few seconds. There seemed no chance of either while the final Quidditch game of the season was looming. Ron wanted to talk tactics with Harry all the time, and had little thought for anything else. Ron was not unique in this respect. Interest in the Gryffindor-Ravenclaw game was running extremely high throughout the score, for the match would decide the championship, which was still wide open. If Gryffindor beat Ravenclaw by a margin of 300 points, a tall order, and yet Harry had never known his team fly better, then they would win the championship. If they won by less than 300 points, they would come second to Ravenclaw. If they lost by 100 points, they would be third behind Hufflepuff, and if they lost by more than 100, they would be in fourth place, and nobody, Harry thought, would ever let him forget that it had been he who had captained Gryffindor to their first bottom-of-the-table defeat in 2 centuries. The run-up to this crucial match had all the usual features. Members of rival houses attempting to intimidate opposing teams in the corridors, unpleasant chants about individual players being rehearsed loudly as they passed, the team members themselves either swaggering around enjoying all the attention, or else dashing into bathrooms between classes to throw up. Somehow the game had become inextricably linked in Harry's mind with the success or failure of his plans for Ginny. He could not help feeling that if they won by more than 300 points, the scenes of euphoria and a nice loud after-match party might be just as good as a hearty swig of Felix Felicis. In the midst of all his preoccupations, Harry had not forgotten his other ambition, finding out what Malfoy was up to in the Room of Requirement. He was still checking the Marauders map, and as he was often unable to locate Malfoy on it, deduced that Malfoy was still spending plenty of time within the room. Although Harry was losing hope that he would never succeed in getting inside the room, he attempted it whenever he was in the vicinity. But no matter how he reworded his request, the wall remained firmly doorless. A few days before the match against Ravenclaw, Harry found himself walking down to dinner alone from the common room, Ron having rushed off into a nearby bathroom to throw up yet again, and Hermione having dashed off to see Professor Vector about a mistake she thought she might have made in her last arithmancy essay. More out of habit than anything, Harry made his usual detour along the 7th floor corridor, checking the Marauders map as he went. For a moment he could not find Malfoy anywhere, and assumed he must indeed be inside the Room of Requirement again. But then he saw Malfoy's tiny, labelled dot standing in a boy's bathroom on the floor below, accompanied not by Crabbe or Goyle, but by Moaning Myrtle. Harry only stopped staring at this unlikely coupling when he walked right into a suit of armour. The loud clash brought him out of his reverie. Hurrying from the scene, lest Filch should turn up, he dashed down the marble staircase and along the passageway below. Outside the bathroom he pressed his ear against the door. He couldn't hear anything. He very quietly pushed the door open. Draco Malfoy was standing with his back to the door, his hands clutching either side of the sink, his white blonde hair and his head bowed. "Don't!" crooned Moaning Myrtle's voice from one of the cubicles. "Don't! Tell me what's wrong. I can help you." "No one can help me," said Malfoy. His whole body was shaking. "I can't do it. I can't. It won't work. And unless I do it soon, he says he'll kill me." And Harry realised, with a shock so huge it seemed to root him to the spot, that Malfoy was crying. Actually crying. Tears streaming down his pale face into the grimy basin. Malfoy gasped and gulped, and then, with a great shudder, looked up into the cracked mirror and saw Harry staring at him over his shoulder. Malfoy wheeled around, drawing his wand. Instinctively, Harry pulled out his own. Malfoy's hex missed Harry by inches, shattering the lamp on the wall beside him. Harry threw himself sideways, fought Lever Corpus, and flicked his wand, but Malfoy blocked the jinx and raised his wand for another. "No, no, stop it!" squealed Moaning Myrtle, her voice echoing loudly around the tiled room. "Stop! Stop!" There was a loud bang, and the bin behind Harry exploded. Harry attempted a leglocker curse that backfired off the wall behind Malfoy's ear and smashed the cistern beneath Moaning Myrtle, who screamed loudly. Water poured everywhere, and Harry slipped over as Malfoy, his face contorted, cried, "Crucia! Sectum Sempra!" bellowed Harry from the floor, waving his wand wildly. Blood spouted and spurted from Malfoy's face and chest as though he had been slashed with an invisible sword. He staggered backwards and collapsed onto the waterlogged floor with a great splash, his wand falling from his limp right hand. "No!" gasped Harry. Slipping and staggering, Harry got to his feet and plunged forwards towards Malfoy. whose face was now shining scarlet, his white hands scrabbling at his blood-soaked chest. "No, I didn't." Harry did not know what he was saying. He fell to his knees beside Malfoy, who was shaking uncontrollably in a pool of his own blood. Moaning Myrtle let out a deafening scream. "Murder! Murder in the bathroom! Murder!" The door banged open again behind Harry, and he looked up, terrified. Snape had burst into the room, his face livid. Pushing Harry roughly aside, he knelt over Malfoy, drew his wand, and traced it over the deep wounds Harry's curse had made, muttering an incantation that sounded almost like song. The flow of blood seemed to ease. Snape wiped the residue from Malfoy's face and repeated his spell. Now the wounds seemed to be knitting. Harry was still watching, horrified by what he had done, barely aware that he too was soaked in blood and water. Moaning Myrtle was still sobbing and wailing overhead. When Snape had performed his counter-curse for a third time, he half lifted Malfoy into a standing position. "You need the hospital wing. There may be a certain amount of scarring, but if you take Dittany immediately, we might avoid even that. Come." He supported Malfoy across the bathroom, turning at the door to say in a voice of cold fury, "And you, Potter, you wait here for me." It did not occur to Harry for a second to disobey. He stood up slowly, shaking, and looked down at the wet floor. There were bloodstains floating like crimson flowers across its surface. He could not even find it in himself to tell Moaning Myrtle to be quiet as she continued to wail and sob with increasingly evident enjoyment. Snape returned 10 minutes later. He stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind him. "Go," he said to Myrtle, and she swooped back into her toilet at once, leaving a ringing silence behind her. "I didn't mean it to happen," said Harry at once. His voice echoed in the cold, watery space. "I didn't know what the spell did." But Snape ignored this. "Apparently I underestimated you, Potter," he said quietly. "Who would have thought you knew such dark magic? Who taught you that spell?" I read about it somewhere." "Where?" "It was a library book," Harry invented wildly. "I can't remember what it was called." "Liar," said Snape. Harry's throat went dry. He knew what Snape was going to do, and he had never been able to prevent it. The bathroom seemed to shimmer before his eyes. He struggled to black out all thought, but, try as he might, the Half-Blood Prince's copy of Advanced Potion-Making swam hazily to the forefront of his mind. And then he was staring at Snape again, in the midst of this wrecked, soaked bathroom. He stared into Snape's black eyes, hoping against hope that Snape had not seen what he feared, but— "Bring me your school bag," said Snape softly, "and all of your school books, all of them. Bring them to me here, now." There was no point arguing. Harry turned at once and splashed out of the bathroom. Once in the corridor, he broke into a run towards Gryffindor Tower. Most people were walking the other way. They gaped at him, drenched in water and blood, but he answered none of the questions fired at him as he ran past. He felt stunned. It was as though a beloved pet had turned suddenly savage. What had the prince been thinking to copy such a spell into his book? And what would happen when Snape saw it? What would he tell Slughorn? Harry's stomach churned. How Harry had been achieving such good results in potions all year. Would he confiscate or destroy the book that had taught Harry so much? The book that had become a kind of guide and friend? Harry could not let it happen. He could not. Why are you soaking? Is that blood?" Ron was standing at the top of the stairs, looking bewildered at the sight of Harry. "I need your book," Harry panted. "Your potions book. Quick, give it to me." "But what about the half-blood?" "I'll explain later." Ron pulled his copy of Advanced Potion Making out of his bag and handed it over. Harry sprinted off past him and back to the common room. Here he seized his school bag, ignoring the amazed looks of several people who had already finished their dinner, threw himself back out of the portrait hole and hurtled off along the 7th floor corridor. He skidded to a halt beside the tapestry of dancing trolls, closed his eyes and began to walk. "I need a place to hide my book. I need a place to hide my book. I need a place to hide my book." 3 times he walked up and down in front of the stretch of blank wall. When he opened his eyes, there it was at last, the door to the room of requirement. Harry wrenched it open, flung himself inside, and slammed it shut. He gasped. Despite his haste, his panic, his fear of what awaited him back in the bathroom, he could not help but be overawed by what he was looking at. He was standing in a room the size of a large cathedral, whose high windows were sending shafts of light down upon what looked like a city with towering walls, built of what Harry knew must be objects hidden by generations of Hogwarts inhabitants. There were alleyways and roads bordered by teetering piles of broken and damaged furniture, stowed away, perhaps to hide the evidence of mishandled magic, or else hidden by castle-proud house elves. There were thousands and thousands of books, no doubt banned or graffitied or stolen. There were winged catapults and fanged frisbees, some still with enough life in them to hover half-heartedly over the mountains of other forbidden items. There were chipped bottles of congealed potions, hats, jewels, cloaks. There were what looked like dragon egg shells, corked bottles whose contents still shimmered evilly, several rusting swords and a heavy, blood-stained axe. Harry hurried forwards into one of the many alleyways between all the hidden treasure. He turned right past an enormous stuffed troll, ran on a short way, took a left at the broken, vanishing cabinet in which Montague had got lost the previous year. Finally, pausing beside a large cupboard which seemed to have had acid thrown at its blistered surface. He opened one of the cupboard's creaking doors. It had already been used as a hiding place for something in a cage that had long since died. Its skeleton had 5 legs. He stuffed the Half-Blood Prince's book behind the cage and slammed the door. He paused for a moment, his heart thumping horribly, gazing around at the clutter. Would he be able to find this spot again, amidst all this junk? Seizing the chipped bust of an ugly old warlock from on top of a nearby crate, he stood it on the cupboard where the book was now hidden, perched a dusty old wig and a tarnished tiara on the statue's head to make it more distinctive, and then sprinted back through the alleyways of hidden junk as fast as he could go, back to the door, back out to the corridor where he slammed the door behind him, and it turned at once back into stone. Harry ran flat out towards the bathroom on the floor below, cramming Ron's copy of Advanced Potion Making into his bag as he did so. A minute later, he was back in front of Snape, who held out his hand wordlessly for Harry's school bag. Harry handed it over, panting, a searing pain in his chest, and waited. One by one, Snape extracted Harry's books and examined them. Finally, the only book left was the potions book, which he looked at very carefully before speaking. "This is your copy of Advanced Potion Making, is it, Potter?" "Yes," said Harry, still breathing hard. "You're quite sure of that, are you, Potter?" "Yes," said Harry, with a touch more defiance. "This is the copy of Advanced Potion Making that you purchased from Flourish and Blots?" "Yes," said Harry firmly. "Then why," asked Snape, "does it have the name Runel Waslib written inside the front cover?" Harry's heart missed a beat. That's my nickname," he said. "Your nickname?" repeated Snape. "Yeah, that's what my friends call me," said Harry. "I understand what a nickname is," said Snape. The cold black eyes were boring once more into Harry's. He tried not to look into them. Close your mind. Close your mind. But he had never learned how to do it properly. Do you know what I think, Potter?" said Snape very quietly. "I think that you are a liar and a cheat, and that you deserve detention with me every Saturday until the end of term. What do you think, Potter?" I don't agree, sir," said Harry, still refusing to look into Snape's eyes. "Well, we shall see how you feel after your detentions," said Snape. 10 o'clock Saturday morning, Potter. My office." "But, sir," said Harry, looking up desperately. "Quidditch! The last match of the—" 10 o'clock, whispered Snape, with a smile that showed his yellow teeth. "Poor Gryffindor. 4th place this year, I fear." And he left the bathroom without another word, leaving Harry to stare into the cracked mirror, feeling sicker, he was sure, than Ron had ever felt in his life. "I won't say I told you so," said Hermione, an hour later in the common room. "Leave it, Hermione," said Ron angrily. Harry had never made it to dinner. He had no appetite at all. He had just finished telling Ron, Hermione and Ginny what had happened. Not that there seemed to have been much need. The news had travelled very fast. Apparently Moaning Myrtle had taken it upon herself to pop into every bathroom in the castle to tell the story. Malfoy had already been visited in the hospital wing by Pansy Parkinson, who had lost no time in vilifying Harry far and wide, and Snape had told the staff precisely what had happened. Harry had already been called out of the common room to endure 15 highly unpleasant minutes in the company of Professor McGonagall, who had told him he was lucky not to have been expelled, and that she supported wholeheartedly Snape's punishment of detention every Saturday until the end of term. "I told you there was something wrong with that Prince person," Hermione said, evidently unable to stop herself. "And I was right, wasn't I?" "No, I don't think you were," said Harry stubbornly. He was having a bad enough time without Hermione lecturing him. The looks on the Gryffindor team's faces when he had told them he would not be able to play on Saturday had been the worst punishment of all. He could feel Ginny's eyes on him now, but did not meet them. He did not want to see disappointment or anger there. He had just told her that she would be playing Seeker on Saturday, and that Dean would be rejoining the team as Chaser in her place. Perhaps if they won, Ginny and Dean would make up during the post-match euphoria. The thought went through Harry like an icy knife. "Harry," said Hermione. "How can you still stick up for that book when that spell... Will you stop hanging or harping on about the book?" snapped Harry. "The prince only copied it out. It's not like he was advising anyone to use it. For all we know, he was making a note of something that had been used against him." "I don't believe this," said Hermione. "You're actually defending..." "I'm not defending what I did," said Harry quickly. "I wish I hadn't done it. And not just because I've got a dozen detentions. You know I wouldn't have used a spell like that. Not even on Malfoy. But you can't blame the prince. He hadn't written 'Try this out, it's really good.' He was just making notes for himself, wasn't he? Not for anyone else." "Are you telling me," said Hermione, "that you're going to go back and get the book?" "Yeah, I am," said Harry forcefully. "Listen, without the prince, I'd never have won the Felix Felicis. I'd never have known how to save Ron from poisoning. I'd never have got a reputation for potions, brilliance you don't deserve," said Hermione nastily. "Give it a rest, Hermione," said Ginny. And Harry was so amazed, so grateful, he looked up. By the sound of it, Malfoy was trying to use an unforgivable curse. You should be glad Harry had something good up his sleeve. "Well, of course I'm glad Harry wasn't cursed," said Hermione, clearly stunned. "But you can't call that Sectum Sempra spell good, Ginny. Look where it's landed him. And I'd have thought, seeing what this has done to your chances in the match..." "Oh, don't start acting as though you understand Quidditch," snapped Ginny. "You'll only embarrass yourself." Harry and Ron stared. Hermione and Ginny, who had always got on together very well, were now sitting with their arms folded, glaring in opposite directions. Ron looked nervously at Harry and then snatched up a book at random and hid behind it. Harry, however, though he knew he little deserved it, felt unbelievably cheerful all of a sudden, even though none of them spoke again for the rest of the evening. His light-heartedness was short-lived. There were slivering taunts to be endured next day, not to mention much anger from fellow Gryffindors, who were most unhappy that their captain had got himself banned from the final match of the season. By Saturday morning, whatever he might have told Hermione, Harry would have gladly exchanged all the Felix Felicis in the world to be walking down to the Quidditch pitch with Ron, Ginny and the others. It was almost unbearable to turn away from the mass of students streaming out into the sunshine, all of them wearing rosettes and hats and brandishing banners and scarves, to descend the stone steps into the dungeons and walk until the distant sounds of the crowd were quite obliterated, knowing that he would not be able to hear a word of commentary or a cheer or a groan. "Ah, Potter," said Snape, when Harry had knocked on the door and entered the unpleasantly familiar office that Snape, despite teaching floors above now, had not vacated. It was as dimly lit as ever, and the same slimy dead objects were suspended in coloured potions all around the walls. Ominously, there were many cobweb boxes piled on a table where Harry was clearly supposed to sit. They had an aura of tedious, hard and pointless work about them. "Mr. Filch has been looking for someone to clear out these old files," said Snape softly. "They are the records of other Hogwarts wrongdoers and their punishments. Where the ink has grown faint or the cards have suffered damage from mice, we would like you to copy out the crimes and punishments afresh, and making sure that they are in alphabetical order, replace them in the boxes. You will not use magic." "Right, Professor," said Harry, with as much contempt as he could put into the last 3 syllables. "I thought you could start," said Snape, a malicious smile on his lips, "with boxes 1012 to 1056. You will find some familiar names in there, which should add interest to the task. Here, you see?" He pulled out a card from one of the topmost boxes with a flourish and read, "James Potter and Sirius Black, apprehended using an illegal hex upon Bertram Aubrey. Aubrey's head twice normal size. Double detention." Snape seared. It must be such a comfort to think that, though they are gone, a record of their great achievements remains. Harry felt the familiar boiling sensation in the pit of his stomach. Biting his tongue to prevent himself retaliating, he sat down in front of the boxes and pulled one towards him. It was, as Harry had anticipated, useless, boring work, punctuated, as Snape had clearly planned, with the regular jolt in the stomach that meant he had just read his father or Sirius's names, usually coupled together in various petty misdeeds, occasionally accompanied by those of Remus Lupin and Peter Pettigrew. And while he copied out all their various offences and punishments, he wondered what was going on outside, where the match would have just started. Ginny playing Seeker against Cho. Harry glanced again and again at the large clock ticking on the wall. It seemed to be moving half as fast as a regular clock. Perhaps Snape had bewitched it to go extra slowly. He could not have been here for only half an hour. An hour and a half. Harry's stomach started rumbling when the clock showed 12:30. Snape, who had not spoken at all since setting Harry his task, finally looked up at 1:10.
I think that will do, he said coldly. Mark the place you have reached. You will continue at 10 o'clock next Saturday. Yes, sir. Harry stuffed a bent card into the box at random and hurried out of the door before Snape could change his mind, racing back up the stone steps, straining his ears to hear a sound from the pitch. But all was quiet. It was over then. He hesitated outside the crowded great hall, then ran up the marble staircase. Whether Gryffindor had won or lost, the team usually celebrated or commiserated in their own common room. Quid agis, he said tentatively to the fat lady, wondering what he would find inside. Her expression was unreadable as she replied, You'll see, and she swung forwards. A roar of celebration erupted from the hole behind her. Harry gaped as people began to scream at the sight of him. Several hands pulled him into the room. We won, yelled Ron, bounding into sight and brandishing the silver cup at Harry. We won! 450 to 140! We won! Harry looked around. There was Ginny running towards him. She had a hard, blazing look in her face as she threw her arms around him, and without thinking, without planning it, without worrying about the fact that 50 people were watching, Harry kissed her. After several long moments, or it might have been half an hour or possibly several sunlit days, they broke apart. The room had gone very quiet. Then several people wolf-whistled, and there was an outbreak of nervous giggling. Harry looked over the top of Ginny's head to see Dean Thomas holding a shattered glass in his hand, and Romilda Vane looking as though she might throw something. Hermione was beaming, but Harry's eyes sought Ron. At last he found him, still clutching the cup and wearing an expression appropriate to having been clubbed over the head. For a fraction of a second they looked at each other. Then Ron gave a tiny jerk of the head that Harry understood to mean, well, if you must. The creature in his chest roaring in triumph, Harry grinned down at Ginny and gestured wordlessly out of the portrait hole. A long walk in the grounds seemed indicated, during which, if they had time, they might discuss the match. Chapter 25. The Seer Overheard. The fact that Harry Potter was going out with Ginny Weasley seemed to interest a great number of people, most of them girls, yet Harry found himself newly and happily impervious to gossip over the next few weeks. After all, it made a very nice change to be talked about because of something that was making him happier than he could remember being for a very long time, rather than because he had been involved in horrific scenes of dark magic. You'd think people had better things to gossip about, said Ginny, as she sat on the common room floor, leaning against Harry's legs and reading the Daily Prophet. 3 Dementor attacks in a week, and all Romilda Vane does is ask me if it's true you've got a hippogriff tattooed across your chest. Ron and Hermione both roared with laughter. Harry ignored them. What did you tell her? I told her it's a Hungarian horntail, said Ginny, turning a page of the newspaper idly. Much more macho. Thanks, said Harry, grinning. And what did you tell her Ron's got? A pygmy puff, but I didn't say where. Ron scowled as Hermione rolled around laughing. Watch it, he said, pointing warningly at Harry and Ginny. Just because I've given my permission doesn't mean I can't withdraw it. Your permission, scoffed Ginny. Since when did you give me permission to do anything? Anyway, you said yourself you'd rather it was Harry than Michael or Dean. Yeah, I would, said Ron grudgingly, and just as long as you don't start snogging each other in public. You filthy hypocrite. What about you and Lavender, thrashing around like a pair of eels all over the place, demanded Ginny. But Ron's tolerance was not to be tested much as they moved into June, for Harry and Ginny's time together was becoming increasingly restricted. Ginny's owls were approaching, and she was therefore forced to revise for hours into the night. On one such evening, when Ginny had retired to the library, and Harry was sitting beside the window in the common room, supposedly finishing his herbology homework, but in reality reliving a particularly happy hour he had spent down by the lake with Ginny at lunchtime, Hermione dropped into the seat between him and Ron with an unpleasantly purposeful look on her face. I want to talk to you, Harry. What about? Said Harry suspiciously. Only the previous day Hermione had told him off for distracting Ginny when she ought to be working hard for her examinations. The so-called half-blood prince. Oh, not again, he groaned. Will you please drop it? He had not dared to return to the room of requirement to retrieve his book, and his performance in potions was suffering accordingly, though Slughorn, who approved of Ginny, had jocularly attributed this to Harry being lovesick. But Harry was sure that Snape had not yet given up hope of laying hands on the prince's book, and was determined to leave it where it was while Snape remained on the lookout. I'm not dropping it, said Hermione firmly, until you've heard me out. Now, I've been trying to find out a bit about who might make a hobby of inventing dark spells. He didn't make a hobby of it. He, who says it's a he? We've been through this, said Harry crossly. Prince. Hermione, Prince.
Right, said Hermione, red patches blazing in her cheeks as she pulled a very old piece of newsprint out of her pocket and slammed it down on the table in front of Harry. Look at that. Look at the picture. Harry picked up the crumbling piece of paper and stared at the moving photograph. Yellowed with age, Ron leaned over for a look too. The picture showed a skinny girl of around 15. She was not pretty. She looked simultaneously cross and sullen, with heavy brows and a long, pallid face. Underneath the photograph was the caption, Eileen Prince, captain of the Hogwarts Gobstones team. So, said Harry, scanning the short news item to which the picture belonged. It was a rather dull story about inter-school competitions. Her name was Eileen Prince. Prince, Harry. They looked at each other and Harry realised what Hermione was trying to say. He burst out laughing. No way! What? You think she was the half-blood? Oh, come on. Well, why not, Harry? There aren't any real princes in the wizarding world. It's either a nickname, a made-up title somebody's given themselves, or it could be their actual name, couldn't it? No, listen. If say her father was a wizard whose surname was Prince and her mother was a muggle, then that would make her a half-blood prince. Yeah, very ingenious, Hermione. But it would. Maybe she was proud of being a half-a-prince. Listen, Hermione, I can tell it's not a girl. I can just tell. The truth is that you don't think a girl would have been clever enough, said Hermione angrily. How can I have hung around with you for 5 years and not think girls are clever, said Harry, stung by this. It's the way he writes. I just know the prince was a bloke, I can tell. This girl hasn't got anything to do with it. Where did you get this anyway? The library, said Hermione predictably. There's a whole collection of old prophets up there. Well, I'm going to find out more about Eileen Prince if I can. Enjoy yourself, said Harry irritably. I will, said Hermione, and the first place I'll look, she shot at him as she reached the portrait hole, is records of old potions awards. Harry scowled after her for a moment and then continued his contemplation of the darkening sky. She's just never got over you outperforming her in potions, said Ron, returning to his copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi. You don't think I'm mad, wanting that book back, do you? Course not, said Ron robustly. He was a genius, the prince. Anyway, without his bazaar tip, he drew his finger significantly across his own throat. I wouldn't be here to discuss it, would I? I mean, I'm not saying that spell you used on Malfoy was great. Nor am I, said Harry quickly. But he healed all right, didn't he? Back on his feet in no time. Yes, said Harry. This was perfectly true, although his conscience squirmed slightly all the time. Thanks to Snape. You still got detention with Snape this Saturday, Ron continued. Yeah, and the Saturday after that, and the Saturday after that, sighed Harry. And he's hinting now that if I don't get all the boxes done by the end of term, we'll carry on next year. He was finding these detentions particularly irksome because they cut into the already limited time he could have been spending with Ginny. Indeed, he had frequently wondered lately whether Snape did not know this, for he was keeping Harry later and later every time, while making pointed asides about Harry having to miss the good weather and the varied opportunities it offered. Harry was shaken from these bitter reflections by the appearance at his side of Jimmy Peakes, who was holding out a scroll of parchment. Thanks, Jimmy. Hey, it's from Dumbledore, said Harry excitedly, unrolling the parchment and scanning it. He wants me to go to his office, as quick as I can. They stared at each other. Blimey, whispered Ron. You don't reckon... He hasn't found... Better go and see, hadn't I, said Harry, jumping to his feet. He hurried out of the common room and along the 7th floor as fast as he could, passing nobody but Peeves, who swooped past in the opposite direction, throwing bits of chalk at Harry in a routine sort of way and cackling loudly as he dodged Harry's defensive jinx. Once Peeves had vanished, there was silence in the corridors, with only 15 minutes left until curfew. Most people had already returned to their common rooms. And then Harry heard a scream and a crash. He stopped in his tracks, listening. How dare you! Ah! The noise was coming from a corridor nearby. Harry sprinted towards it, his wand at the ready, hurtled around another corner and saw Professor Trelawney sprawled upon the floor, her head covered in one of her many shawls, several sherry bottles lying beside her, one broken. Professor! Harry hurried forwards and helped Professor Trelawney to her feet. Some of her glittering beads had become entangled with her glasses. She hiccuped loudly, patted her hair and pulled herself up to Harry's helping arm. What happened, Professor? You may well ask, she said shrilly. I was strolling along, brooding upon certain dark portents I happened to have glimpsed. But Harry was not paying much attention. He had just noticed where they were standing. There, on the right, was the tapestry of dancing trolls, and on the left, that smoothly impenetrable stretch of stone wall that concealed... Professor, were you trying to get into the room of requirement? Omens, I have been vouchsafed... What? She looked suddenly shifty. The room of requirement, repeated Harry. Were you trying to get in there? I didn't know students knew about. Not all of them do, said Harry. But what happened? You screamed. It sounded as though you were hurt. Well, said Professor Trelawney, drawing her shawls around her defensively and staring down at him with her vastly magnified eyes. I wish to deposit certain, personal items in the room. And she muttered something about nasty accusations. Right, said Harry, glancing down at the sherry bottles. But you couldn't get in and hide them? He found this very odd. The room had opened for him, after all, when he'd wanted to hide the Half-Blood Prince's book. Oh, I got in all right, said Professor Trelawney, glaring at the wall. But there was somebody already in there. Somebody in? Who? Demanded Harry. Who was in there? I have no idea, said Professor Trelawney, looking slightly taken aback at the urgency in Harry's voice. I walked into the room, and I heard a voice, which has never happened before in all my years of hiding, or using the room, I mean. A voice? Saying what? I don't know that it was saying anything, said Professor Trelawney. It was whooping. Whooping? Gleefully, she said, nodding. Harry stared at her. Was it male or female? I would hazard a guess at male, said Professor Trelawney. And it sounded happy. Very happy, said Professor Trelawney sniffily, as though it was celebrating. Most definitely. And then I called out, who's there? You couldn't have found out who it was without asking, Harry asked her, slightly frustrated. The inner eye, said Professor Trelawney with dignity, straightening her shawls and many strands of glittering beads. It was fixed upon matters well outside the mundane realms of whooping voices. Right, said Harry hastily. He had heard about Professor Trelawney's inner eye all too often before. And did the voice say who was there? No, it did not, she said. Everything went pitch black, and the next thing I knew, I was being hurled headfirst out of the room. And you didn't see that coming, said Harry, unable to help himself. No, I did not. As I say, it was pitch. She stopped and glared at him suspiciously. I think you'd better tell Professor Dumbledore, said Harry. He ought to know Malfoy's celebrating. I mean, that someone threw you out of the room. To his surprise, Professor Trelawney drew herself up at this suggestion, looking haughty. The headmaster has intimated that he would prefer fewer visits from me, she said coldly. I am not one to press my company upon those who do not value it. If Dumbledore chooses to ignore the warnings the cards show... Her bony hand closed suddenly around Harry's wrist. Again and again, no matter how I lay them out. And she pulled a card dramatically from underneath her shawls. The lightning-struck tower, she whispered. Calamity. Disaster. Coming nearer all the time. Right, said Harry again. Well, I still think you should tell Dumbledore about the voice and everything going dark and being thrown out of the room. You think so? Professor Trelawney seemed to consider the matter for a moment, but Harry could tell that she liked the idea of retelling her little adventure. I'm going to see him right now, said Harry. I've got a meeting with him. We could go together. Oh, well, in that case, said Professor Trelawney with a smile. She bent down, scooped up her sherry bottles, and dumped them unceremoniously in a large blue and white vase standing in a nearby niche. I miss having you in my classes, Harry, she said soulfully, as they set off together. You were never much of a seer, but you were a wonderful object. Harry did not reply. He had loathed being the object of Professor Trelawney's continual predictions of doom. I'm afraid, she went on, that the centaur knows nothing of cartomancy. I asked him, one seer to another, had he not too sensed the distant vibrations of coming catastrophe? But he seemed to find me almost comical. Yes, comical! Her voice was rather hysterical, and Harry caught a powerful whiff of sherry, even though the bottles had been left behind. Perhaps the horse has heard people say that I have not inherited my great-great-grandmother's gift. Those rumours have been bandied about by the jealous for years. You know what I say to such people, Harry? Would Dumbledore have let me teach at this great school, put so much trust in me all these years, had I not proved myself to him? Harry mumbled something indistinct. I will remember my first interview with Dumbledore, went on Professor Trelawney in throaty tones. He was deeply impressed. Of course, deeply impressed. I was staying at the Hog's Head, which I do not advise, incidentally. Bedbugs, dear boy, but funds were low. Dumbledore did me the courtesy of calling upon me in my room at the inn. He questioned me. I must confess that at first I thought he seemed ill-disposed towards divination, and remember I was starting to feel a little odd. I had not eaten much that day. But then... And now Harry was paying attention properly for the first time, for he knew what had happened then. Professor Trelawney had made the prophecy that had altered the course of his whole life, the prophecy about him and Voldemort. But then we were rudely interrupted by Severus Snape." "What?" "Yes, there was a commotion outside the door and it flew open, and there was that rather uncouth barman standing with Snape, who was waffling without having come the wrong way up the stairs, although I'm afraid that I myself rather thought he had been apprehended eavesdropping on my interview with Dumbledore. You see, he himself was seeking a job at the time, and no doubt hoped to pick up tips. Well, after that, Dumbledore seemed much more disposed to give me a job, and I could not help thinking, Harry, that it was because he appreciated the stark contrast between my own unassuming manners and quiet talent compared to the pushing, thrusting young man who was prepared to listen at keyholes. Harry, dear." She looked back over her shoulder, having only just realised that Harry was no longer with her. He had stopped walking, and they were now 10 feet from each other. "Harry," she repeated uncertainly. Perhaps his face was white, to make her look so concerned and frightened. Harry was standing stock still as waves of shock crashed over him, wave after wave, obliterating everything except for information that had been kept from him for so long. It was Snape who had overheard the prophecy. It was Snape who had carried the news of the prophecy to Voldemort. Snape and Peter Pettigrew together had sent Voldemort hunting after Lily and James and their son. Nothing else mattered to Harry just now. "Harry," said Professor Trelawney again. "Harry, I thought we were going to see the headmaster together." "You stay here," said Harry through numb lips. "But dear, I was going to tell him how I was assaulted in the room of—" "You stay here," Harry repeated angrily. She looked alarmed as he ran past her, round the corner into Dumbledore's corridor, where the lone gargoyle stood sentry. Harry shouted the password at the gargoyle and ran up the moving spiral staircase 3 steps at a time. He did not knock upon Dumbledore's door, he hammered, and the calm voice answered, "Enter," after Harry had already flung himself into the room. Fawkes the Phoenix looked around, the bright black eyes gleaming with reflected gold from the sunset beyond the window. Dumbledore was standing at the window, looking out at the grounds, a long black travelling cloak in his arms. "Well, Harry, I promised that you would come with me." For a moment or two, Harry did not understand. The conversation with Trelawney had driven everything else out of his head, and his brain seemed to be moving very slowly. "Come with you?" "Only if you wish it, of course." "If I—" And then Harry remembered why he had been eager to come to Dumbledore's office in the first place. "You found one? You found a Horcrux?" "I believe so." Rage and resentment fought shock and excitement for several moments. Harry could not speak. "It's natural to be afraid," said Dumbledore. "I'm not scared," said Harry at once, and it was perfectly true. Fear was one emotion he was not feeling at all. "Which Horcrux is it? Where is it?" "I'm not sure which it is, though I think we can rule out the snake, but I believe it to be hidden in a cave on the coast many miles from here. A cave I have been trying to locate for a very long time. The cave in which Tom Riddle once terrorised 2 children from his orphanage on their annual trip. You remember?" "Yes," said Harry. "How is it protected?" "I do not know. I have suspicions that may be entirely wrong." Dumbledore hesitated and then said, "Harry, I promised you that you could come with me, and I stand by that promise. But it would be very wrong of me not to warn you that this will be exceedingly dangerous." "I'm coming," said Harry, almost before Dumbledore had finished speaking. Boiling with anger at Snape, his desire to do something desperate and risky had increased tenfold in the last few minutes. This seemed to show on Harry's face, for Dumbledore moved away from the window and looked more closely at Harry, a slight crease between his silver eyebrows. "What has happened to you?" "Nothing," lied Harry promptly. "What has upset you?" "I'm not upset." "Harry, you were never a good oculomans." The word was the spark that ignited Harry's fury. "Snape," he said very loudly, and Fawkes gave a soft squawk behind them. "Snape's what's happened. He told Voldemort about the prophecy. It was him. He listened outside the door. Trelawney told me." Dumbledore's expression did not change, but Harry thought his face whitened under the bloody tinge cast by the setting sun. For a long moment, Dumbledore said nothing. "When did you find out about this?" he asked at last. "Just now," said Harry, who was refraining from yelling with enormous difficulty, and then suddenly he could not stop himself. "And you let him teach here, and he told Voldemort to go after my mum and dad!" Breathing hard as though he was fighting, Harry turned away from Dumbledore, who still had not moved a muscle, and paced up and down the study, rubbing his knuckles in his hand and exercising every last bit of restraint to prevent himself knocking things over. He wanted to rage and storm at Dumbledore, but he also wanted to go with him to try and destroy the Horcrux. He wanted to tell him he was a foolish old man for trusting Snape, but he was terrified that Dumbledore would not take him along unless he mastered his anger.
"Harry," said Dumbledore quietly, "please listen to me."
It was as difficult to stop his relentless pacing as to refrain from shouting. Harry paused, biting his lip, and looked into Dumbledore's lined face.
"Professor Snape made a terrible—"
"Don't tell me it was a mistake, sir. He was listening at the door."
"Please let me finish."
Dumbledore waited until Harry had nodded curtly, and then went on.
"Professor Snape made a terrible mistake. He was still in Lord Voldemort's employ on the night he heard the first half of Professor Trelawney's prophecy. Naturally, he hastened to tell his master what he had heard, for it concerned his master most deeply. But he did not know, he had no possible way of knowing, which boy Voldemort would hunt from then onwards, or that the parents he would destroy in his murderous quest were people that Professor Snape knew, that they were your mother and father."
Harry let out a yell of mirthless laughter. "He hated my dad like he hated Sirius. Haven't you noticed, Professor, how the people Snape hates tend to end up dead?"
"You have no idea of the remorse Professor Snape felt when he realized how Lord Voldemort had interpreted the prophecy. Harry, I believe it to be the greatest regret of his life, and the reason that he returned."
"But he's a very good occupant, isn't he, sir?" said Harry, whose voice was shaking with the effort of keeping it steady. "And isn't Voldemort convinced that Snape's on his side, even now? Professor, how can you be sure Snape's on our side?" Dumbledore did not speak for a moment. He looked as though he was trying to make up his mind about something. At last he said,
"I am sure. I trust Severus Snape completely."
Harry breathed deeply for a few moments in an effort to steady himself. It did not work. "Well, I don't," he said, as loudly as before. "He's up to something with Draco Malfoy right now, right under your nose, and you still—"
"We have discussed this, Harry,"
said Dumbledore, and now he sounded stern again.
"I have told you my views."
"You're leaving the school tonight, and I'll bet you haven't even considered that Snape and Malfoy might decide to—"
"To what?"
asked Dumbledore, his eyebrows raised.
"What is it that you suspect them of doing precisely?"
"They're up to something," said Harry, and his hands curled into fists as he said it. "Professor Trelawney was just in the room of requirement, trying to hide her sherry bottles, and she heard Malfoy whooping, celebrating. He's trying to mend something dangerous in there, and if you ask me, he's fixed it at last. And you're about to just walk out of school without—"
"Enough!"
said Dumbledore. He said it quite calmly, and yet Harry fell silent at once. He knew that he had finally crossed some invisible line.
"Do you think that I have once left the school unprotected during my absences this year? I have not. Tonight, when I leave, there will again be additional protection in place. Please do not suggest that I do not take the safety of my students seriously, Harry."
"I didn't," mumbled Harry, a little abashed, but Dumbledore cut across him.
"I do not wish to discuss the matter any further."
Harry bit back his retort, scared that he had gone too far, that he had ruined his chance of accompanying Dumbledore, but Dumbledore went on.
"Do you wish to come with me tonight?"
"Yes," said Harry at once.
"Very well then. Listen."
Dumbledore drew himself up to his full height.
"I take you with me on one condition, that you obey any command I might give you at once, and without question."
"Of course."
"Be sure to understand me, Harry. I mean that you must follow even such orders as run, hide, or go back. Do I have your word?"
Yes, of course."
"If I tell you to hide, you will do so?"
"Yes."
"If I tell you to flee, you will obey?"
"Yes."
"If I tell you to leave me and save yourself, you will do as I tell you?" "Harry!"
They looked at each other for a moment. "Yes, sir."
"Very good. Then I wish you to go and fetch your cloak and meet me in the entrance hall in 5 minutes' time."
Dumbledore turned back to look out of the fiery window. The sun was now a ruby-red glare along the horizon. Harry walked quickly from the office and down the spiral staircase. His mind was oddly clear all of a sudden. He knew what to do. Ron and Hermione were sitting together in the common room when he came back. "What does Dumbledore want?" Hermione said at once. "Harry, are you okay?" she added anxiously. "I'm fine," said Harry shortly, racing past them. He dashed up the stairs and into his dormitory, where he flung open his trunk and pulled out the Marauder's map and a pair of balled-up socks. Then he sped back down the stairs and into the common room, skidding to a halt where Ron and Hermione sat, looking stunned. "I haven't got much time," Harry panted. "Dumbledore thinks I'm getting my invisibility cloak. Listen." Quickly he told them where he was going and why. He did not pause either for Hermione's gasps of horror or for Ron's hasty questions. They could work out the finer details for themselves later. "So you see what this means," Harry finished at a gallop. "Dumbledore won't be here tonight. So Malfoy's going to have another clear shot at whatever he's up to. No, listen to me, he hissed angrily, as both Ron and Hermione showed every sign of interrupting. I know it was Malfoy celebrating in the Room of Requirement. Here. He shoved the Marauder's map into Hermione's hand. You've got to watch him, and you've got to watch Snape too. Use anyone else you can rustle up from the DA. Hermione, those contact galleons will still work, right? Dumbledore says he's put extra protection in the school, but if Snape's involved, he'll know what Dumbledore's protection is, and how to avoid it. But he won't be expecting you lot to be on the watch, will he? Harry, began Hermione, her eyes huge with fear. Haven't got time to argue, said Harry curtly. Take this as well. He thrust the socks into Ron's hands. Thanks, said Ron. Why do I need socks? You need what's wrapped in them. It's the Felix Felicis. Share it between yourselves and Ginny too. Say goodbye to her from me. I'd better go. Dumbledore's waiting. No, said Hermione, as Ron unwrapped the tiny little bottle of golden potion, looking awestruck. We don't want it. You take it. Who knows what you're going to be facing? I'll be fine. I'll be with Dumbledore, said Harry. I want to know you lot are okay. Don't look like that, Hermione. I'll see you later. And he was off, hurrying back through the portrait hole towards the entrance hall. Dumbledore was waiting beside the oaken front doors. He turned as Harry came skidding out onto the topmost stone step, panting hard, a searing stitch in his side.
I would like you to wear your cloak, please,
said Dumbledore, and he waited until Harry had thrown it on before saying,
Very good. Shall we go?
Dumbledore set off at once down the stone steps, his own travelling cloak barely stirring in the still summer air. Harry hurried alongside him under the invisibility cloak, still panting and sweating rather a lot. But what will people think when they see you leaving, Professor? Harry asked, his mind on Malfoy and Snape.
That I am off into Hogsmeade for a drink, said Dumbledore lightly. I sometimes offer Rosmerta my custom, or else visit the Hog's Head, or I appear to. It is as good a way as any of disguising one's true destination.
They made their way down the drive in the gathering twilight. The air was full of the smells of warm grass, like water and wood smoke from Hagrid's cabin. It was difficult to believe that they were heading for anything dangerous or frightening. Professor, said Harry quietly, as the gates at the bottom of the drive came into view. Will we be apparating?
Yes, said Dumbledore. You can apparate now, I believe.
Yes, said Harry, but I haven't got a licence. He felt it best to be honest. What if he spoiled everything by turning up 100 miles from where he was supposed to go?
No matter, said Dumbledore. I can assist you again.
They turned out of the gates into the twilight. Deserted lane to Hogsmeade. Darkness descended fast as they walked, and by the time they reached the high street, night was falling in earnest. Lights twinkled from windows over shops, and as they neared the Three Broomsticks, they heard raucous shouting. And stay out! Shouted Madame Rosmerta, forcibly ejecting a grubby-looking wizard. Oh, hello, Albus. You're out late.
Good evening, Rosmerta. Good evening. Forgive me. I'm off to the Hog's Head. No offence, but I feel like a quieter atmosphere tonight.
A minute later, they turned a corner into the side street where the Hog's Head sign creaked a little. Though there was no breeze, in contrast to the Three Broomsticks, the pub appeared to be completely empty.
It will not be necessary for us to enter, muttered Dumbledore, glancing around, as long as nobody sees us go. Now place your hand upon my arm, Harry. There is no need to grip too hard. I am merely guiding you. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Harry turned. At once there was that horrible sensation that he was being squeezed through a thick rubber tube. He could not draw breath. Every part of him was being compressed, almost past endurance, and then, just when he thought he must suffocate, the invisible hands and bands seemed to burst open, and he was standing in cool darkness, breathing in lungfuls of fresh, salty air.
Video falan yazmış. Hangi bölüm okuyorsun? Bilgisayar programcılığı. Bu orijinalse arkadaşlar orijinalde gelebilirsiniz. T-Launcher'da gelebilirsiniz. Ondan sonra YouTube'a dahil abone olmamış vasat ezik insanların şaka yapıyorum bu arada. İnsanların kullandığı launcher'lardan da gelebilir. İstediğiniz launcher'dan gelebilirsiniz arkadaşlar. Aslında beni işe alabilirsin. Her IP'yi diyen atarım. Ya 12 level olsak onu yapmaya bile gerek kalmaz ya Mordecai. Direkt adam ünlem IP yazar gelir chat'e. Yani çok iyi olur aslında. TikTok'ta karşıma çıktın, doğrudur. TikTok'ta, Instagram'da, Short'ta, her yerdeyiz aga. Bizim mod yapsana. Şu an moda ihtiyacım yok Benjamin ya. Ya zaten şöyle diyeyim, bizim Discord'umuz var. Birebir tanıdığım neredeyse bir sürü insan var. Ve bu insanlardan yaparım büyük bir ihtimalle ya. TikTok'ta MC Bilmeyenler 3 videosunu izledim daha demin. Güzel miydi peki? Ne dersin videoya? Ya uğraştırdı video. YouTube'da güzel tutuyor şu an. Umarım daha da yükselecek bakalım. İzlemeyen varsa bu arada ünlem son video. Ya tanıdığın derken oğlum tanıştık en azından. Tamam, her şeyle tanımadık tüm moderatörleri. Sonuçta yüz yüze tanışmadığım insanlar var. Aması var yani, sonuçta tanıyorum. Hiç bilmediğim biri misiniz diyor. Fly korumasından öldüm, çıldıracağım. Ya Cesim, nasıl yakalandım Fly'a? Taşlar az. Yok ya, yeterli. Zaten çıktık yukarıya kadar. Biz de 250'ye kadar çıkmıyoruz arkadaşlar. Of, bot craftlamıyorum. Neyse. Spoiler veriyordum az daha kendimce. Yeni video spoiler. Ya yeni video güzel olacak gibi bu arada ya. Bana Mordecai demeyin, coşkun deyin. Kanka doğru diyorsun. Öyle seviyor olabilirsin ama ben nickleri direkt okuyorum ya. Herkes aklımda tutamam öyle. Ya haliyle. GF 9500 GT. Öyle bir kart biliyorum ben ya. Normalde yok mu? Markası yoktur belki de, modeli biliyorum. Duymuştum. Umuytat YouTube ne YouTube'u? Discord hesabıyla Minecraft hesabını onaylamış. Eyvallah canım. Minecraft moderatörü. Ona da ihtiyaç yok ki. Yeni açacağımız şeyde, Survival'da bunu minimuma indireceğiz. Ya benim kafamda arkadaşlar şöyle diyeyim. Binlerce kişiye bir iş paslamaktansa her şey otomatik olsun. Minimum efektle maksimum iş. Hani bu olayı istiyorum. O yüzden ayarladığımız her şeyi abi, sen ne yapıyorsun Eymur? Ayarlayacağımız her şeyi ona göre dizayn ediyorum. Umarım düşersin Eymur. Aşağı yat aşağı Eymur. Beni bu arada kritiklerse öldürür. Öldür onu. Mod add-on. Mod derken Minecraft sonuçta mod eklemeyi düşünmüyorum ben. Çünkü yok, düşünmüyorum. Hiç onu diyeceğin aklıma gelmemişti. Su kulesine mi gel? Ya dur bir yemeğimi yiyip. Minty'yi öldürür müsün? Beni trolledi. Minty ölmüş ki zaten. Arkadaşlar yeni ele gireceğiz bu arada. Geçiş efektini çok kullanmışsın. Hangisinde? Her bilgi arasında kullandım onu. Evet çok, ama 10 tane var ya, 11-12 tane falan geçiş efekti kullanmak zorunda kaldım. Arkadaşlar takım yasak ve adamlar takım nasıl oluyor? Nasıl yani? Emir Bora hesabını onaylamış. Eyvallah Elif, aşağı düşürme beni bu arada. Yo Elif ya, 18 PvP Elif. Ya yapma. Efecan kazandı. Elif de aşağı mı atladı? Bu arada takımlarsa arkadaşlar söyleyin. Deyin ki bu adamla bu adam takım. Değil. Yani adamlar öldükten sonra yapamayız bir şey. YouTube kanalının ismini versene. Direkt kanalın adıyla aynı. Apernix. YouTube mod alımı ne zaman? Ya düşünmüyorum dediğim gibi. Zaten çok fazla insan izlemiyor YouTube'da. Ana odak Twitch. Çünkü YouTube'da ne bileyim çok izlensek bile. Ya ne bileyim. Bilmiyorum. Of ya. Ulan Elif. Çekiyorum herkesi lobideki. Gelecek vardır umarım. Çünkü 20 kişiyiz, az önce de 20'ydik. Niye artmıyoruz arkadaşlar? Sunucuya gelebilirsiniz. Discord'umuzdan sunucu kanalına IP alıp gelebilirsiniz. Edux çıkma. Ya of. Of ya. Bekle, ben geleceğim. Ama otomatik başlıyor. Ben başlatmıyorum. Soulfly Discord'umuza katılmış. Hoş geldiniz efendim. Abi sesine ağzına bakıyorum.